Good evening. I'd like to call to order this special town council meeting for Tuesday, March 21st, 2023. Please rise for a moment of silence. Of the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Allenson? Here. Carmody?
Here.
Fishbein?
Here.
Laffin?
Here.
Marone? Tata?
Here.
Testa?
Here.
Zandri?
Here.
Chairman Cervoni.
Here, thank you. On to item 3A. These are being moved individually.
Mr. Chairman, I move we approve an appropriation of funds in the amount of $36,680 from the federal grants account to the expenditures account for the Columbus House Incorporated.
Moved, seconded by Councilor Allenson. Discussion. Councilor Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had requested, not specifically for Columbus House, but for all of the consent agenda items to be pulled. My rationale for that is just that I feel that things that we may be discussing later in this meeting might bring some clarity as to the process, as to how ones that were recommended to us, why others were not. And I'm also, I don't think I want to give the money to the businesses and nonprofits right now who just happen to be early on the committee's agenda. I would prefer that we wait until the committee is completed with its work, and then we address all of these at one time in the end. Again, it's really, the applicants had no say in when their applications were reviewed, and there's still a lot that still have not been reviewed, so I would rather just wait until the end and approve them all at the same time, especially in light of the memo we received yesterday afternoon, I believe it was, where there were issues found with 2 that were on this list for us to approve, and then these issues were found, looks like a little bit later in the game, so I just wanted to leave a little bit of leeway for contingencies like that to happen later on. So that was my reason for pulling these from the consent agenda. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, but that's where I stand at this point. Thank you.
Councilor Fishbein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being the member who also sits on the application review committee, I just want to point out that to my knowledge, the way the applications are being reviewed is not in a first in, first out fashion. Rather, it's by randomizer. That was agreed upon by the committee to try and prevent that first in, first out situation. I just wanted to take an opportunity to talk about this particular application because, you know, I think that's important as well. As you know, the Columbus House is our homeless shelter. And for those of us that have actually gone there and seen what it's like, it's very tight, it's very small. And, you know, through COVID, it's difficult to have people close to each other, quite frankly. And this application, if I recall correctly, was to replace and to put in a ventilation system that would prevent the transmission of such things as COVID, which could be airborne. So I'm in support of what the committee recommended to this body through the process, and those are the only comments I wanted to make. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else on the council? Councilor Allenson.
The committee has been reviewing applications over several meetings now, and I have watched every one of them. If anybody has any questions on the process, we also were emailed the process by the committee by which we would know if we didn't watch the meetings. So I don't see how we would become more enlightened as to their process in this. I believe that from the perspective of writing out the contracts, this would also be better to do in bursts, such as, you know, we have so many applications approved, we get them through the law department and we get the money out to the people who need it. Whether or not we have questions on the rest of the applications or the other items, I don't think that this is something, in my opinion, that should be held back. 8 to 1 of us voted to have this committee reviewing the applications. 8 to 1 of us voted to, all 9 of us appointed people who I'm assuming would operate in the best interest of the applicants. So I think as a council, it is our duty to also serve the people with approving the checks to go out for the applications that have been approved by the committee that we appointed.
Okay. I don't see any other hands on the council. Any comments from the public? There being none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Ellenson,
Yes.
Carmody,
Yes.
Fishbein,
Yes.
Laffin,
Yes.
Marone, sorry, Tata,
Abstain.
Testa,
Yes.
Zandri,
Yes.
Chairman Cervoni.
Yes. The grant's approved. Before we move on, Mr. Senna is here on behalf of the Finance Department, and he may not be necessary if none of us have questions for him. And so I just wonder if any of the counselors do have questions for him, because if we don't, we can send him home.
I just, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a quick question about the process of how these approved applications are going to be paid. I mean, is that going to happen in the next few weeks, the next few months? What does that process look like?
I guess it will probably be next couple of weeks. So
Okay.
once they get the proper documentation in, we'll set up the accounts in the system and get the checks out. It's all that.
Great. No, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. All right. Thank you.
So that's the goal, okay? So it's essentially my office, where I'm short-staffed, and his office. And in particular, the nonprofits, they're each unique. So doing them all at once, you're going to hear me screaming from wherever you are in the town of Wallingford. That's really going to be an incredible burden. This is not something we're used to doing. We've started putting stuff together on the assumption that the ones at least that were recommended would be approved. So it's better that it not be done all at once. And the goal will be to try to get as many as we can out within a couple of weeks, but I can't guarantee that that's going to happen, but we'll do our best.
Just to make clear what I think perhaps is not clear, the delay can be, it's not just sending a check out. We have an obligation to monitor exactly how the money is going to be spent, and that means a contract assigning by each of the recipients. So that is what is a step, a process that will take time. The Corporation Council has indicated probably for each of the nonprofits, it's a different obligation that's being evidenced in writing and commitment. So that's what sits behind the time factor.
Councilor Fishbein?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question along those lines first, but well, I'll do it that second. With regard to Mr. Senna, I have no objection. I know there's other things on this agenda, and I don't know if, there may be a question of him at that point. So I have no problem, maybe that can be dealt with at a subsequent meeting. But I have no objection to Mr. Sena leaving. But with regard to the contract, nonprofits many times have boards of directors. So are we going to require proof that a board met and agreed to the contract? What are we looking for from them? A lot of times you get like a president who signs the thing on behalf of the entity, and then, president.
Well, if they
goes
need
away.
board authorization, they'll have to get it. I mean, it depends on what their authorization is to act without that. So whatever their authorization they need, they'll have to demonstrate that they have it.
Okay, that's fair.
It may be different in different circumstances, so. And if it's for a program, that's an entirely different discussion about what the contract looks like. And if they're buying equipment, if they're paying $10,000 or more for their equipment, the federal law requires that we have 3 verbal quotes. So I've already told people in advance, telling them, the ones that have been approved by the committee, I've already told them in advance that if it's approved here, that those are things that they're going to need. Some of them have already told me they've worked on it, they're ready to go. If it's for a hiring position, they have to have a job description. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but it has to be something. So I'm starting to give people a heads up, or I gave people a heads up, that these are the things that we'll be looking for, a couple of the things, to do the agreement.
So, as on the committee, a lot of times we look at the backup for the anticipated expenditure. And that's part of our criteria to look at. So if an applicant comes and says, I'm going to buy, now I know Barron's was a very detailed with a lot of different things. I know Barron's is off the table now, given the status. But an application that is recommended to be approved, we are then saying to them, even though you have the stuff in your packet and this is what you represented the grant was going to be used for, we're still making them go get 3 bids, and then is it lowest or local is the determiner?
Well, they can only do what they've asked, they can only buy the equipment that they've asked to buy for. So if they've, several of them have already indicated we've already gotten quotes before, I'm assuming before they even put their proposal together. So, if it's for a stove and they showed you a stove, I mean, I don't know. We'll have to take a look at it, and I'll deal with the consultant as to what it is, but.
Well, I just want to say that the 3 bid thing has not come into.
Right, that part, yeah, it wouldn't, yes, I understand.
And if we're going to go down that road, we might want to discuss implements being purchased from local entities when, the difference isn't that much, right? So.
Well, I mean, that would be another requirement that we would be adding, but, so anyone who's in that category, I've already reached out to them, and everyone seems to be pretty positive in their response that that's something that they either have already done or are doing right now. So to tell them who to go look for the bids for and that it should be, I'm not sure that that's really something I should be doing.
Okay, this is the first that, I've been up here, I think every meeting up here on this. This is the first I'm hearing about a post-application requirement to go out and get 3 bids.
Yeah, so we, Tim and I sat down with the consultant and we started going through everything we're going to need to document in order to comply with the federal rules. So that's where a lot of this is coming from. So for example, I did not know ahead of time that if you're hiring someone for a position, there needs to be a job description. It doesn't necessarily have to be elaborate or anything, but we have to have a copy of that. So everyone seems to be perfectly receptive to complying with those requirements.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gross, I see you hovering. Do you have a question for the comptroller? Name and address for the record, please.
Debbie Gross, Long Hill Road. I have a question regarding the contracts and the monitoring process. So are all the funds going to be dispersed at the time the contract is signed?
Not necessarily. We're going to look at each one as to if somebody already has, the order form with the dollar amounts, everything that needs to be paid, it'll probably be cut at that time. All of those details will be worked out. I don't have, for each one of these applications, all that decided at this time. The goal is that we're going to require that they document the purchase, we receive documentation of the purchase, they understand that they are not to spend it on anything but what they were approved for, and that if for some reason they don't spend the money, they're not getting the rest of it, or if they've gotten it, they've got to give it back. So there's all the federal requirements is what's going to be built in. We'll look at, hopefully we don't have a situation where we have to have an individual contract different from everybody else's, but that's the goal, and that we make it as painless as possible, not only for them, but for us. So we're responsible for the monitoring, we're responsible for when the audit has to be done, so we want to make sure we have the proper documentation and the proof, but we don't want to be torturing people and getting that done.
Understood. I just know with grants, a lot of times they're like reimbursement based on expenditures. So I know some of the grants are small amounts, but there's others that are considerable amounts. And in those cases, to allocate a substantial sum of money, it'd be more difficult to retract that once you gave it out. So I didn't know if based on, quarterly reimbursements, based on proof of expenditures, and following all those rules, if that would be incorporated into the contract. Because, like I said, from a grant perspective, I've got a little bit of a background in that, and so I know that that's usually how they work. And so you don't get into wrinkles with the government.
Right. I mean, that's understood, and, keeping in mind that particularly for small businesses, they may not be in a position to front the money. So, we'll be looking to do the safeguards. With respect to the nonprofits, especially the program, it may very well be, some portions of it may be a reimbursement, some of them may be quarterly. We really need to sit down with the individual agencies, particularly on the programs, and actually work out a fine detailed as to how it's going to be done.
Well, even with the small businesses, maybe you could do like 50% upon X or 25 and then whatever so that would help you in the long run monitor that so you don't have to double back, and sometimes it's more difficult to double back than it is to try to monitor along the way.
That's our goal.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Senna, it appears that you continue to sit here either at your pleasure or your displeasure, and I'll leave it to you to decide which it is. See you next week. Sure. All right, on to 3A double I.
Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the appropriation of funds in the amount of $25,000 from federal grants account to expenditure account for the Lyman Hall Music Parents Association.
Second.
Moved and seconded. To be clear, did we say the amount?
$25,000.
Thank you. Okay. Councilor Testa, did you want to speak?
Well, I might have missed something here.
Yeah.
I didn't. We're taking these individually now.
Councilor Tata removed the consent agenda.
But you moved the consent agenda. That just meant 3A. 3A was not on the consent agenda, but 3A could be one motion. That's what removed from consent means.
Well, should it be your pleasure to move the entire 3A, then we'll entertain that.
That would be my pleasure.
Second.
All right. The entire balance after I of 3A has been moved. For the benefit of the clerk, actually, Councilor Laffin, would you consider that a friendly amendment to your motion?
Yes.
Okay. And Councilor Autumn, you had seconded
Second.
Councilor Laffin's
Second.
motion, so you then second. I think we're in line. Councilor Fishbein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I did, when the application came before the committee, based upon ties that I have to the Wallingford Symphony Orchestra, I did recuse myself from that particular item. I would like to be able to vote on the remainder of 3A, though, as I recognize no conflict.
So we could recognize your abstention from 3A Roman numeral 8.
If that procedure really puts me in an ethical place, I will certainly be willing to do that.
I'm fine with it. All right. Any other comments from the council?
I have one.
Councilor Zandri.
So I have a point of order I'd like to talk about. Janice, I talked to you earlier about this, and before we go any further with the votes, I would like a ruling from your office on whether or not Councilor Fishbein sitting in both positions, both as self-appointment to the ARPA committee and then also here voting, if that is something that's acceptable. The concern that I have is that it doesn't allow for good due process, in my opinion. We've got him making recommendations on one committee, positive or negative, whatever they might be. Then he brings them back to this committee, this council, and then he votes on them a second time. So I'd like to get a ruling on whether or not that should continue or if it's permissible in the first place.
So, I mean, that is a question I kind of pondered, but so this is my reaction to that issue. I don't view it as an ethical issue. I'm not, and as I always say when someone wants to talk to me about ethics, is I'm not the Board of Ethics, but I don't see it that way. However, I see it as a council issue as to whether or not is that what you intended? You allowed yourselves to be appointed to this committee. It's not like it's a subcommittee of the council, which then would go back to the full council. It's a separate committee. And then when it comes back to the council, I really, my reaction, and it's not a perfect reaction because I really have actually pondered this question, is whether or not that individual from the council's position should then be acting on the things that that committee did. And the concern I would have is that a member who sat on that committee would be in a position to bring, or maybe that goes to the later issues, something that wasn't approved by the ARPA committee or was approved and this individual objected to it, to bring it to the full council in a different manner. I don't know if I just made any sense, but that would kind of bother me, but I think that's really a council issue. I don't know what you intended when you authorized your own members to sit on this committee. What was your expectation? But it would seem to me that if you don't believe it's appropriate, I don't think it's an ethics issue. I think it's a question of whether or not that was something you as a group anticipated would happen and be appropriate. So I'm going to kick it to the 9 of you.
Councilor Fishbein.
So it's interesting that this would come up after allegations have been made about ethical conduct regarding this body. Certainly this body, when it created subcommittee, didn't put any constraints and didn't say that we couldn't self-appoint. And there has been numerous meetings of this body since that time. In fact, I think I was the one who called the first meeting because nobody had done anything. So I said, let's created this thing. I noticed the first meeting. I ran the first meeting. I made sure that a chairman who was not myself was elected and a vice chairman who was not myself elected. The procedure has been going on for a while. Certainly if there was a good faith concern, the avenue to seek that has long since passed. I understand the retaliatory nature of the ask at this point. I respect that.
If I could ask you a question, off the top of your head, how many meetings of this committee have you sat through?
Almost a dozen.
Okay. Counselor Allenson?
Far be it for me to defend Counselor Fishbein, but we didn't object to him appointing himself in the meeting where he did so. So while I also find it odd, I guess I didn't find it odd enough at the time, so I don't think there's any going back. So, you know, I totally understand where you're coming from, but I don't know that it's appropriate.
That was kind of my point with asking about how many meetings.
Right, well,
he's
the
attended.
reason I brought it up was simply because this is the first time that we've got items up here to discuss and vote on. We may have discussed other things, there may have been other meetings. This is the first time that we're saying yes or no up here. Remember, the ARPA committee makes the recommendations. We make the final decision. My only concern is the due process for these people. If they're told no once, we get that feedback from the ARPA committee. We have an option up here to change that. That is our task up here. If they bring us forward accepted applications, we can agree with them and say yes. They can bring us up denials and we can turn it around and approve them anyway, or agree with the original assessment. The only thing that I'm concerned with is that if any of those organizations that are declined are done so, they're getting declined a second time from the same individual. It's not like they've got an opportunity to seek a whole new order and be able to be heard. But if there's no concern up here, I've asked the question and I'm good enough to move on.
Counselor Fishbein.
One must recognize the process that the application review committee follows. First of all, this body constrained that body to have all votes by a supermajority. Nothing can pass that body unless it's 7 votes at least out of a body of 10. This body, I guess by its own machinations, if there is a review of an application, that review, or perhaps that permission, obviating the decision of the review committee, is on a much lower standard. It's 5 votes, not the 7. So for one to say that the same action can be undertaken in the application review committee as here just isn't factually true. Also, the way the votes happen. Up here, we all get 1 vote. We all get, our votes are equal. On the application review committee, our votes are fractionalized because the votes are a component of score. So one could score an application, Counselor Tada could score it at 100 if she was on the application review committee. I could get to 20, and it's an average between the two, so it's the entire body. It's a totally different scoring system. So the whole process is different. All of us could have self-appointed, I mean, under the rules, because we didn't constrain. So I understand where we are, and I'm just trying to follow the charge. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. That's all I have from the council. This is on the entirety of 3A. Any comments from the public? Noting Councilor Fishbein's abstention from item 8, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Allenson?
Yes.
Carmody?
Yes.
So not Fishbein.
No, I'm going to vote
Okay, Fishbein,
yes, but not with number 8.
not number 8. Laffin?
Yes.
Tada?
Abstain.
Testa?
Yes.
Zandri?
Yes.
Chairman Cerrone.
Yes, the motion passes. On to item 3B. So obviously we're eliminating items 4 and 8.
Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of Councilor Testa's amendment in the last motion, I move we approve the appropriation of funds from the federal grants account to the expenditures account for items 3B 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion on this motion. No hands on the council. Anything from the public? There being none. Councilor Fishbein.
I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, one of the requirements is that the entity be in existence pre-pandemic. And we required that as part of this, that the entity showed that they had been affected by the pandemic. And my concern is that one of these entities was transferred during the pandemic, basically at the end of it. And on the committee, I took the position that if there was an impact, that would have been absorbed in the purchase sale price. We did discuss it on the committee. The application did pass muster ultimately. I'm going to vote in favor of what's before us because of the spirit, but I just wanted to share that difficulty, in reviewing these. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Laffin.
Councilor Fishbein, would you like to divide the question and remove that item to a separate motion?
No, I don't. I appreciate the offer. Through the many times on the committee where you come to the table with an impression about an application, a program, or something like that, and collectively we discuss, and you move to a different place. And I think through those discussions and my reflection thereafter, I'm comfortable with voting in favor. However, I could see someone coming to us afterwards and saying, this was the criteria, this application didn't meet it, why did you approve? So I'm not going to tell you which one it is because I don't want to, throw that out there. I just want to share one of the things that's been difficult in reviewing these given the criteria. So I appreciate the offer, but I will be voting in favor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councilor Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been reading the minutes. I believe I know which one we're referring to. And I just wanted to maybe get clarification. If you don't want to identify it, it's fine, but I would just like maybe clarification for everyone's benefit as to why the committee chose to recommend that they get the money if they didn't fit the criteria. I believe so, if you care to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, without attempting to speak for the committee, I think the general thought process was that because it was a familial transfer, the grandfather who owned the company, was running the company, decided to retire, and I believe it was his granddaughter that purchased it. So closely held transaction, and it was felt that it was a continuation of an ongoing activity, although a different business. That's the best I can explain.
Any further discussion on the 3B motion? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Allenson?
Yes.
Carmody?
Yes.
Fishbein?
Yes.
Laffin?
Yes.
Tata?
Abstain.
Testa,
Yes.
Zandri,
Yes.
Chairman Cervoni.
Yes, the motion passes. On to item 4. Attorney Small, did you want to give us any prefatory notes or just leave us to our own devices?
I like the second option, thank you.
All right. Counselor Allenson?
So, Tiffany, I will send you this when I've read it. So I'm a firm believer that the attitude and tone used when we're presenting an idea or proposal sets the mood for the group in determining the direction for that proposal. The town council presented an opportunity and appointed individuals to do a very positive thing for our community, and by majority vote, we approved the unfiltered by UHY, so by the consultant, amount to be dispersed should the request be viable. Each councilor and the mayor appointed individuals to the committee who they saw fit to serve Wallingford businesses and nonprofits in this way. This should have set a positive tone for the committee to go forth and assess the viability of applications it would review. What we ended up with from the very beginning of this committee's formation was a disappointing amount of personal commentary, and a committee that has openly shared their opinions, both political and personal, of some of our members on the council, and misrepresentations of the charge by a few individuals. One member mentioned on the January 25th meeting that their interpretation of ARPA is different from that of the town, implying that they don't agree that grants should be given to a business as part of this exercise. Another mentioned in that same conversation that they, as an individual, I'm taking out gender, view the committee's charge as, quote, limiting the amounts of grants that this individual distributes. How can that be true when the council approved by an 8-to-1 majority vote the total amount applied for by businesses and non-for-profits in the amount of $7,384,271.77? One would think that if a person's gut instinct does not jibe with what the council decided, that person might not want to be part of a committee in charge of dispersing the funds unless the intent was to limit them under a smokescreen of quality of business and/or qualification. When we look at the averaging data, we will also note that two individuals are in the bottom 3 scores with a few exceptions on business applications, and in the instance of one of them, the scores are 2 standard deviations lower than the mean of the average scores of the entire committee. That standard deviation is 8.68 points. So this person, their average is 15 points lower than the mean for all of the businesses in their total decision making. The lowest scorer averages 50.68. The next lowest score averages 54.8. The mean of all business applications decided on so far is 65.94. That's failing. I'd like to restate that this process was supposed to create a positive impact on the businesses and not-for-profits for this town. It is not for us, nor was it the charge of the committee to pontificate on the viability of business, the worthiness of the management, or otherwise make light of the disparaging situation presented by these businesses and not-for-profit stakeholders. If my shoe gives me a blister and someone else with narrower feet, or less sweaty feet if we're being honest, puts on my shoes and does not get a blister, does that make the blister on my foot invalid? No. I wore the shoes I had. There will always be a could've or a would've in every situation, but if you're not the person buying my shoes, in my opinion, you don't have a right to an opinion on my blisters or why I got them. Some businesses and not-for-profits barely failed by the scoring criteria. I'd like to propose I'd like to and will propose an automatic approval of applications that pass, to pass when one standard deviation of the individual average score is added to the score. This means that we would pass 27 businesses instead of 16, which is 66% of the total applications that have visited the committee to date. My reason for adding to all of the scores and not subtracting from any is, again, because this should be a positive exercise where we do the best that we can for each. From a not-for-profit perspective, doing the same exercise would pass all 12 out of 12 to date. This approval process recognizes that there may be sides to an argument. For example, when scores are clustered together, the standard deviation is very low, meaning that there's not much variance in the opinions of the scorers, and that adds to the validity of the score. When the standard deviation is very high, this means that there are polarized scores, and it is reasonable to consider this deviation to bring the score back to a more positive but central view. I can share several examples of instances in which the average scores missed by margins of points. I can also share several examples in which there are a few individuals who mark very low and a few individuals who mark higher. But when you look at the averages, most people's don't go very high above the accepting score for businesses, which the highest average for businesses is 74 points. It doesn't make sense to me, and the passing is 70 points on the rubric. So it doesn't make much sense to me why that big of a disparity can exist between those two scorers unless two people are getting different information. Or we're bringing predisposed notions, or we are comparing projects to others, which we have, as a council, said we would not like them to do. So, this being the data so far, I'd like to make a motion for the council to approve all current and future applications that have an average score plus one standard deviation of the individual scores, which again will vary by request. If others agree, I'm happy to collect this data and provide it to the council for verification and to make these approvals.
Second.
Moved and seconded. So who are we going to entrust to do the math?
Microsoft Excel.
Okay. Councilor Fishbein.
I guess the peril that is run is that the results of the deliberations of the committee, now that you attempt to move the goalposts, gets moved again to meet not the actual content of the applications in the backup, but the intended desire, which is to give out money without process. You know, some of the applications have been judged based on, well, this entity does a lot for the town. Well, that's not a scoring criteria. We've gotten applications that, we had an application at our last meeting where the entity, it's a business, represents that they're in the wholesale clothing industry, that prior to COVID, they had negatives as far as income. After COVID, negatives as to income. The capital infusion of the owner of the business is close to minus $1 million. The application is to give $25,000 in ARPA funds to open up a storefront on Center Street and to sell clothing. Well, an application like that, I think it's appropriate to look at, can the applicant run a business? I mean, if you're running a loss of about $100,000 every year, is it appropriate, is it proper fiscal responsibility of this body to say, here's $25,000? Go find a storefront. I mean, attached to the application, there was no, this is the storefront, this is available. There was nothing. Some other applications that we've gotten, the entity hasn't made any more than $7,000 in a year. The one that I'm thinking of, actually, their high point was during the pandemic. And now it's, give us $25,000 because we want to do this other venture. Committee says, well, if you aren't operating your current business, what are we to rely upon to give you $25,000, which is more than you've ever made, to open up another business? And we score accordingly. So if now it is, doesn't matter what the committee does, doesn't matter about the 10 scores coming together, we're just going to move the goalpost, then I must question, why have a committee at all? We spend a lot of time reviewing applications, the backup, coming together, talking about the applications. And I shared, if you listened to the meeting, a few meetings ago, the people that are on the committee, I don't think I'd ever sit down at dinner with, but I've really enjoyed being together with people that I probably never would have had dinner together with. And I mentioned that, one of these times somebody's going to bring brownies to one of these because we're coming like a family. It's been a good-natured discussion all around about many applications. And, sometimes during the discussions, things move and scores move, and, based upon that, well, did you see that in the tax return? And, and that kind of stuff. And we're all working together. I think any member of the committee will tell you. One of the applications that failed, actually, was one of the ones that I scored the highest. It was the Zion Church. And, they wanted to do some infrastructure improvements, and in their application, they said, we know that churches were closed during COVID. They didn't have people, giving donations, that they had to use the money that they had put in the bank for other things. Well, that perfectly, in my mind, fits into ARPA, right? So I scored that very high. That application, once we did the scores, came in at 73.5, which the cutoff is 75. And I said I was disappointed, but I also said that is the process. Now, what I could have done, if I was unethical, is I could have said, well, I gave it a 90. Let me give it 100. It probably would have put it over the top. But I didn't. I sat there and I said, I'm disappointed, but this is the process. Those are the things that we're struggling with. I once again must question, if we're going to move the goalposts, why even have the committee? So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Laffin.
Thank you. I came here tonight thinking, or with the concept, the idea that ultimately my support would be for the council to review all failed and rejected applications and to have the committee continue on as they have. And then just as they fail or as they get rejected, we could figure out and take them one at a time or in groups or special meetings for all of us to decide. And I know that kind of covers agenda items 4A and 5, because I'm applying that to the committee and to the applications that were not moved forward into the committee, but were rejected by UHY for some sort of disqualifying feature or lack of item. because I am concerned on some level that some of the applications didn't proceed at either level because something was missing, a T was not crossed or an I was not dotted. And throughout the whole process, I talked about, I wanted to be able to go back and say, like, can you get, all right, we're missing this, get this, we're missing that, get that. Like, let's try and work this out. It wasn't a wall to have to climb over. It was a gate that we wanted to be open because we wanted to help these people. I feel like Councilor Allenson's motion with the standard deviation, you're talking about, that has to completely cover these little outliers. You know, you're talking about in these situations, it's likely that one scoring rubric tanked the score. And I think I'm comfortable based on hearing that we would likely approve those anyway, just looking to kind of keep things moving. I don't have a problem reviewing them all. I'm fairly certain that the additional numbers you're talking about all being borderline scoring applications would pass. I don't think the example, in an extreme example of what Councilor Fishbein may have been stating, and if it was, and it failed and still falls within this deviation, then surely the rest of the committee outside of one or so people felt that this was a worthy cause. So I think the deviation could save us some time. And maybe somebody on the committee, I know the chairman's here, the number 70, or is it 75?
70 for recovery of nonprofit and business, 75 for projects for business, or for nonprofits.
So these were numbers that were determined, the committee decided.
The committee decided them.
We're gonna.
Mr. Brudzinski, I'm going to save you a few steps out of respect and tell you can sit in that chair right there. No, with the one with the microphone.
I don't know if he wants to. But.
Oh, no, he's not leaving once he sits down. Just remind us who you are for the record,
Mike
please.
Brodinsky, Chair of the ARPA Committee. I heard some questions and they were sort of easy for me to answer, so I raised my hand, and that's why I'm here. The arrangement is, or the system is, that for a nonprofit, the average score has to be 75 or more, and for the businesses, the average score has to be 70 or more.
Okay. So I'm comfortable, after hearing the work that Councilor Allenson had done, that with these standard deviations that you're talking about, borderline organizations and businesses, of including them in the approval. I mean, we can sit here and approve them anyway, but I'll bet you that we end up approving the additional 12 or 15 or whatever it is anyway. So that's why I do support the motion. And I don't know whether it's appropriate to amend this motion or to make a separate one, but I am in support of all fails and rejections coming back to the council after the committee goes through their process.
Thank you. Councilor Testa?
Thank you. I'm still trying to absorb the formula, and I'll get to that. I don't necessarily disagree with this. For me, it might be a step beyond where I was ready to go tonight. My feelings are that, and I expressed, I sent the chair of the committee an email when, it appeared that, there were some applications they were denying, and I thought, I could foresee wanting to give an application or more applications a second look. I felt that was my right as a counselor. But I wasn't sure how that might go, how we might do that. I was fully aware of the potential implications of us doing that, and a lot of people have expressed different views and so on. So all I wanted to do in the beginning was I simply asked for the rationale for denials as a starting point. I said, all right, you said no. Could you explain why? And that was as far as I wanted to go at this point. I said, now, and then I was thinking, okay, if we are given, if we get a recommendation that's pretty clear that followed what we asked everybody to do, and I wouldn't see how I would overrule that. And this may seem counterintuitive, but so be it. But I wanted the option of taking a look at something that might have been denied. So I simply asked, why was it denied? So I'm in favor, clearly, of the council having the opportunity to reconsider applications that have not been recommended to us. But I'm not necessarily ready to put down new criteria tonight, which this motion potentially is. Not potentially, it clearly is. And so that's why I'm a little uneasy about that. I want us to be, and I thought that's what we're going to do tonight, is say, hey, are we or are we not going to reconsider applications that have not been recommended to us? And that's a big question. And I thought that was going to be the philosophical discussion and the back and forth. And I'm, for example, I'm looking at the recent report we got on a whole number of businesses that were not recommended, and the score was given for a number of them, and a few other reasons were given for others. So I may not want to overrule any of them, but I'd like to know maybe a little bit more as to how these scores were reached or whatever. So give me a little more information. Then I may look at all this and say, yeah, I can understand this, that, but these here, I'm troubled by, I might disagree with, and I want to then try to put together some rationale for overruling it. That's kind of where I was coming into tonight. This formula, this proposal Councilor Allenson has put forward is pretty impressive. I think to simplify it, is it kind of like dropping the low score? That kind of and the high score. Is that kind of how this, is that a simple way of explaining it? No. Then, and I feel like I'm in a movie. I'm not a dumb man. But I'm not quite understanding exactly how this would work. So therefore, I would be a little uncomfortable saying, let's do that. Aside from that, that then kind of may be read as that's going to be the only rationale we're going to now use to overrule a recommendation that is made to not approve an application, when I may have others. So I just think this might be jumping the gun a little bit. And I'd love to see this held and have us just look at it, what I was looking for, and that's just, that's my preference. So I'm a little uneasy right now about this standard deviation thing, because as I said, I'll understand it. But I'm afraid it might then be seen as the only rationale we will then allow ourselves to overrule a committee recommendation. I still revert back to what I said earlier. I would simply like to have the committee give us the reasons they did reach the decision they reached, and then look those over, and then come back into the council and say, these applications here, I'd like us to reconsider. It may involve more discussion with the committee, but that's that. Okay, I'm good for now.
Councilor Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few things I just wanted to bring up. I know you've all heard me say this a million times already, but what's happening now is exactly why I didn't want to go down this road. I know I said right at the very beginning that when we're going to start picking winners and losers, we're going to get ourselves into a jam, and now that's exactly what's happening. There's people that are upset because they thought that they met the criteria and are not being recommended. There are people who are complaining that they received bad advice from the consultant. I've heard there are people that feel that they received bad advice with their applications from various departments in town. So those are concerns, and those are things I was concerned about from the beginning, which is why I thought we would be better spending all of the money on the town. We had $13 million that I think could have been evenly distributed among all the taxpayers, and we wouldn't be in this position. But again, here we are, and I understand that was the will of the council. So with that being said, now that we're here, I don't like the idea of changing the rules of this committee at this point. I think we set the rules, and those are the parameters that we stick to. As Councilor Testa said, we can certainly discuss if we want to look at the ones that were not recommended to us and understand why. But as far as the fact that the committee not giving us enough information or we need to understand why, I think they're giving us great information personally. I read the minutes. I know we get like the email typically the next day or a couple days later that says who was recommended and who wasn't. All of the data is there if we want to look it up. So if we want to see why somebody wasn't recommended, you look at their minutes or you listen to the recordings. So I think we're certainly receiving enough information. And as far as the critique of the committee looking at viability and that being an uncomfortable position, that's actually a requirement. That's one of the requirements that we put, that a business is viable. So I'm not uncomfortable with them looking at that or discussing that. And obviously that's a little bit of an opinion or a judgment call, I should say, on the committee's part. But I'm okay with them taking that position because that's what we've asked them to do. We could have done this ourselves. We could have looked at all these ourselves, but we chose not to. And I trust this committee. I've watched, I've been looking at their work. I think they're doing a very thorough job. I think everybody's taking it very seriously. They're spending a lot of time, in my opinion, reviewing everything and really getting into a lot of detail with these applications. So I'm appreciative of all of you for that. And I never really think it's a good thing for everyone to agree on everything. So the fact that some people maybe are scoring much lower than others, I would expect that, I guess. And up here that happens a lot. I mean, there's a lot of times when one person votes differently than everybody else. It's not that one person's wrong. It's just that there's a difference of opinion. So I'm okay with how things are going with the committee and their scoring, and I think that we should just stay the course and not really change the rules at this point in the game. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Allenson.
So a couple of the businesses that Councilor Fishbein discussed earlier, one of the two passed by the committee, so my adding standard deviations doesn't help it at all. The other one would pass, but marginally. We aren't moving a goal, we're removing bias. So we aren't necessarily saying every goal is, we want to decrease the goal amount. We're saying we are recognizing that there are differences of opinion and they can vary quite greatly on some of these. We're accounting for that and saying, here's a solution. And this is something that as a council we can decide. And while I made the motion, I'm happy to withdraw it and defer it to another time, but we can't keep kicking a ball down the road and expecting it to get picked up somewhere. We are going to have to pick the ball up at some point and put it in a goal. We didn't set the scoring goals when the committee had questions on the rubric itself. The committee came before us and asked us how we would like to proceed, and we took the recommendations of the committee. But the committee did not ever come before us and say, hey, you never set a goal for scoring. We trusted that to the committee, and operating in this fashion is still entrusting that to the committee. It again is just removing the low bias, because when a person has said in a meeting that they view their role on the committee as limiting the amount of grants that go out, it's obvious that that person would be happy that we're failing more businesses than we are passing right now at 49%, 39% passing. So, and then finally on viability, in the scoring sheets, it says the viability of the project. Was the business impacted by COVID negatively? Yes. What is the viability of this project? Not of the business as a whole. I understand that that can be left up to semantics, and my version or idea on that is one thing, and there are many successful business owners on the committee who probably will disagree with me, because it's difficult to say the project is viable when the business wasn't necessarily viable. And then finally, if a business is trying to change the entire way that they're operating when they used to operate only on the internet and now they want a brick and mortar, I see a lot of comments on the forums saying, why do we have all these empty storefronts? We hate looking at empty space in the center of town. You know, why are we not attracting more businesses to our brick and mortar? Simply, it's easier to operate. It's easier to operate on the internet, I guess, than it is to pay rent and overhead and infrastructural costs for running a brick and mortar. However, some of these applicants are endeavoring to do so. And all of this information on why they passed or failed is in the minutes, because before I watch the meetings, I read the minutes, and then I watch the meetings, and then I read the minutes, just to make sure that in some instances, I know minutes for committees can be very brief, but in the instance of this committee, they are extremely detailed, and Cheryl Ann and then Bernadette for the first two, they're doing a fabulous job at recording, and the committee is also doing a fabulous job at recording, so that we have access to it on YouTube. So I'm not intending to disparage the work of the committee, because as a whole, I think you guys are doing fine. I am proud of you. You are accomplishing major things in very short amount of time. I just want to find a way to make an allowance when we have a misunderstanding between two sides of an argument, where we can come to some sort of a happy medium. And if my motion fails, I'm not married to it, but I did this work after I watched all of the meetings and read all of the minutes. If somebody has a better idea, I'd love to hear it.
Councilor Fishbein.
I think the better idea is to respect the recommendation of the group. And I just want to go through one of the, why were they rejected? I think everyone up here has access to the portal, the SureLink portal, where we all can look at the application, the backup, all of that stuff. All of our meetings are recorded. So if the question is, why was an application rejected or not recommended, everything is before you. As to the viability of a project, it's inherent with the viability of the entity. If there's no viability for the entity, then it's very difficult on a 3-page piece of paper to believe that the entity has the ability to do the project. You know, when the YMCA came before us, I knew, the things that were in their application, they've done things like that. Somebody else that was just a startup came to us with that sort of stuff. You have to question, you know, have you done stuff like that? The project itself may have good intentions, but is it viable that if the money goes out, that the project will actually be completed and implemented as we anticipate? So I just want to take a moment, because there was a memo that was issued from our last meeting on March 17. And one of those applications was Riva's Meat Market. And the score average was a 54. So it didn't get recommended. And I have the application up, so let's go through it. They've been in business for about 10 years in Wallingford. They rent. They're a butcher shop and a grocery. Question: provide details of duration of closure during the pandemic. They say 2 weeks. Provide a written statement providing the negative impact. They say during the lockdown in 2020, my business had to close. I was forced to throw away all the perishable items I had at my establishment. Okay, that's viable, right? Provide your gross income for the following years, and we asked for 2019, 2020, and 2021. So in 2019, it was $2,080,000. 2020, $2,048,000. 2021, almost $5 million. So, based upon those numbers, and the tax returns mirror that, the entity has recovered from the pandemic. They are double what they were making even prior to the pandemic. So then you look at what are they looking, how much are they looking for, what are they going to use the money for? And that's on the next page of the application. Now they do indicate that they got PPP loans and HEDCO money. As far as I know, all PPP loans were written off. There's no representation that they had to pay back the PPP loans, so you have to assume that that was written off. So they're asking for $25,000. What are they going to use it for? 3 things. Equipment of $15,000, payroll of $10,000, and bills of $2,500. Now, there's no backup with the application. It doesn't say what equipment, who from, or anything. So is it responsible for us, whether it be the ARPA committee or even the council, to say, here's $15,000, go find equipment for your business? Payroll of $10,000. There's no representation in the application that they couldn't pay payroll. They indicate that they got PPP loans. That was what payroll is for. So is it responsible for the ARPA committee and then perhaps this body to override a rejection, to just say, here's 10 grand, pay payroll that's undefined? Now the bills are $2,500. That could be, I guess, maybe that was the perishables that they had to throw away, right? So, but there's no backup. So it's scored relatively high based upon a relatively poor application. Because we've had other applications that have, a lot of documentary backup. This is what you can actually draw the two together. But this scored at a 54, which which is relatively close. So, I mean, if what we end up with is we are potentially moving the goalpost. In fact, for this body to then say, we don't care what the review committee did, we're just going to grant it anyway, you're not even moving the goalpost, you're getting rid of the goalpost. So that's just an example of, you know, and we have plenty of applications, and I've mentioned during the meetings, it appears that, you know, somebody went around and said, you know, you're a business, you can get $25,000 from the government, put together this application. You know, that, based upon timing, a lot of the applications that were submitted, like on the last day, it was apparent because they had no backup. I would be much more comfortable if this body took the time to look at the stuff before getting rid of the goalposts. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Allenson?
I just asked them to indulge me really quick so I could put some context behind this. Rivas Market, the low score was a 40, the high score was a 65. The average score was a 54. The standard deviation is 8.77. So if you add a standard deviation, it still fails, just so we know.
Councilor Lavin?
Thank you. I wanted to speak to what Councilor Allenson was saying before, and then Councilor Testa, and now what Councilor Allenson had just said. And it references back to what I first said. It's about outliers. The example we just heard is not one that would be changed by this motion, and it's very possible in our review, it sounds like we wouldn't change it. That's an outlier. The council set up the committee with a charge. We didn't establish passing score range or anything like that. We left that up to the committee. And what we did originally set up was a super majority vote being required. Like a yes vote, a no vote, whatever it is. What ends up happening, these aren't simple up or down votes anyway. It's possible that an outlying score of 40 can completely tank what might otherwise average in the mid-70s and bring them below the 70. So Councilor Fishbein had mentioned earlier that we're changing the way basically the votes are being counted. We are, because they're not being counted, I think, what we might have originally thought they were going to be counted as in the first place. The outlying vote, the outlying score vote is worth more than all the other votes. And this simply takes that into consideration by removing some of those outliers. We all know what it's like to be here for hours for an outlier and have a vote come down by an 8-to-1 vote or whatever it would be, and have the cost be, you know, a 4-hour debate for what would have been the same result. But as members of this council, that's what we do. I think I had not considered the deviated thing, deviated numbers before Councilor Allenson had mentioned it and done all that work. I think it works, especially in this case. It doesn't mean we're not going to review the other ones, but we just heard about Rivas Market, and then we heard from Councilor Allenson all those scores. We didn't talk about executive graphic system, which did not receiving a passing score with an average of 69.13. We didn't talk about that one. We talked about the one that had the obvious low score. Okay. I'm all set. Thanks.
Councilor Carmody?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening. I'm still contemplating Councilor Allenson's motion, but I wanted to echo much of what was said by my colleagues up here. I actually believe that the process has always been that the town council, in collaboration with the mayor's office, would ultimately approve or deny the applications. We, as a council, created and appointed the ARPA Application Review Committee to help us in this huge undertaking. They have done painstaking and tedious work in their very thorough review of the applications that they received. I absolutely value the work that they have been doing. This is why we created this advisory committee, to really do a lot of the heavy lifting and to lay the groundwork and to create a starting point for the town council to decide on whether an application should be approved or denied. And again, I am very grateful for the hard work that has been done by the committee. I have watched or listened to most of the committee's meetings, and I think it's saying that they are thorough is an understatement. And so thank you for your hard work. And I can tell you, at least for me, I will weigh your advice and recommendations heavily for when I make my decisions. You know, I think it is unrealistic to think we would agree with every single recommendation that is made. I mean, this council has a hard time agreeing on anything, but the fact of the matter is, I would assume that 95% or more of the committee's recommendations will be taken by this council, and I think that in itself is quite a feat. So I think the town council should not forfeit its duty and responsibility to approve or deny all the ARPA applications, and I think that includes the applications that the consultants initially denied that didn't even make it to the committee. And so I think it's important that the council reviews all applications, denied or approved. I'm still thinking about Councilor Allenson's motion, and that's all I have for now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Councilor Zandri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to bring up a couple of points because they were discussed up here. I want to go back to Councilor Tada's example earlier on about how we're all one vote up here, but everything up here is binary, right? You know, if you vote no on something and we're going to be 8-1, or if I do it too, it's 7-2, it doesn't change the outcome. When we talk about standard deviation, we're talking about the outliers on both sides. So to Councilor Fishbein's point, if he thought that something he supported was going to not make it, without standard deviation, if he wanted to score it real high, it would drag it up. But with standard deviation, it might not allow it to come all the way up it needs to. Because if he's a high outlier, it's going to average him down towards the middle. A low outlier is going to go the same other way. And we see this all day long in everything that we do. Anytime we go shopping online and we're looking at something, it's got 4.5 stars, and we're trying to figure out why there's all these ones in there, we get an idea that maybe they're not justified scores, but they're averaged out that way. This is the same type of thing we do in schools when we grade on a curve. When the teacher goes back later and says there must be something wrong with the output of the exams, if some of our best and brightest didn't even score good on this, might have been something we didn't explain well in class, maybe something that wasn't absorbed in the instruction. Let's look at all the grades, and then we're going to grade on a curve. That doesn't pass everybody either. It brings people that are low up, and maybe some people that failed on the things that even the smartest and the brightest struggled with. It brings them over the top. When we sat here and said we want a supermajority of 7, we thought of something ahead of time. We wanted to make sure that it took a lot of action and activity to move something forward. We didn't think about the fact that it wasn't going to be binary. And by taking a look at this now and saying, look, I would like to see a better mean score, this makes sense. If we had thought about this before, we probably would have enacted it. We didn't. We're imperfect up here. I don't think it does anything to move the goalposts. These scores are already in. All it does is it takes those outliers and drags them towards the center. Like we just saw in one example, it still doesn't pass some people. But what it's going to do is cut our work down up here, because we are going to revisit everything. including the ones that the consultant never gave us, because that's the right thing to do. These people might not have had enough paperwork. They might have thought they could bring it later. There might have been something unclear to them. English might not be their first language. I could sit up here all night. I'm not paid by the word, though. So the idea is that if we're going to take this opportunity to try to make it more fair, to bring more people in, then I'm all for it. That was the very reason we made the motion when we got all of the applications in, and we were marginally higher than the buckets we had originally set, to up the values, because we didn't want to have a dollar amount be in the way. So I'm all for this, because it doesn't manipulate anything. It rounds those scores up, and I think it makes the process more fair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Testa?
Thank you. I want to be clear. I think this the proposal that Councilor Allison has made is terrific. I like it. I think it makes a lot of sense. I merely didn't. I don't want it to be the only criteria we find ourselves allowing ourselves. That was the point I was trying to make. And I probably shouldn't say this, but it's me. I don't want to hear anybody tell me the information's all there. Watch the meetings, read the minutes. If I wanted to do that, I wouldn't have appointed the committee. And I don't mean to say I'm lazy. My point is, we appointed someone to do all of that, and I may not have the ability, the time, or the inclination to go through all of the meeting minutes, watch all the meetings. If I was going to do that, I wouldn't have had them. And I have a right to request a little written summary. If I don't get it, I'll be okay. But don't tell me that I don't deserve it because all the stuff is there. I'm done.
Councilor Fishbein?
So after we looked at the Riva's meat market application, I heard about executive graphics systems. I guess that's one that powers of you would like us to focus on. So I'm going to shift to that one. So, and just for the record, that came in at the 69.13, so it just missed. So this entity apparently has been in business in Wallingford for 18 years, but traditionally it hasn't competed locally, it's competed nationally. And based upon numbers, it says in the application, our business resides online and is operated by myself, the owner of the home. Although we technically never closed, we were in a sense closed due to the nature of our business. And then it talks about how it's shifting from competing nationally to trying to compete locally. It says our business is competing on a national level with some of the largest companies in the U.S. that sell similar products. The only way to compete is to advertise, so on and so forth. So the ask is the $25,000, as I've indicated, is a lot of these applications. And what is the money going to be used for? Well, there's a representation that they're going to secure a small brick and mortar storefront in Wallingford to begin selling their products and services locally, rather than primarily nationally. They estimate the rent is $1,200 a month. They're asking for their first and last, so $3,600. Expecting 4 to 6 months to be rough as the new local business. So that's a startup. Set up shop expenses, office furniture, internet, phone, electrical services, $2,500. Website renovation budget, $4,000 to $5,000. Now, I'll indicate to you that in the tax returns for the entity, it indicates that in 2019, they had no expense for, at least on the tax return, for websites, in 2020, no expense for websites. They do PayPal as call center, delivery charges, and software of $2,500. And then in 2021, there's all of a sudden domains, $23,000. So if the domains were just created in 2021, they need $4,000 to $5,000 to redo the internet based upon the application, because there is no backup once again with this one. They're going to join 1 to 3 locals chambers of commerce. They're asking for ARPA dollars for that, for $500. Acquisition of initial stock of materials. They're going to hire an employee, which Janice has already indicated, going to need some sort of job description. So they want ARPA dollars to be able to hire the part-time employee. When we look at the numbers, the income, at least over the period of time that we're looking at, the gross income in 2019 was $230,000. In 2020, it was $134,000. In 2021, $85,000. So based upon those numbers and the tax returns, it looks like the business as an entity pre-COVID was a declining business, and now it's a startup, which, you know, when you look at viability and that kind of stuff, it gets scored accordingly. So when you say, you know, is it going to score out at 100? No. But that's the reason why something like that is not going to score very high. And once again, that's the stuff that we're looking at. So that's, of the list that we have, that's the closest one that I see that missed. But I think, as indicated, I don't think that was ever the intention of ARPA, was to fund a startup. So I just want to point that out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Tata?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as we're talking, I'm thinking even more, to change the way that we score these in relation to who's going to get recommended and not. I'm getting more and more convinced this is not a good idea. Particularly when I think about our last council agenda, where we had an item that ultimately was removed, that I'm not sure is going to reappear or not. But based on that item, we know that there's at least 3 that someone up here was upset about the way that they were scored. At least 3 applications that were not recommended. And so to change the scoring now, after we've seen who was not recommended, the ones that have been looked at already, I think is just not fair. I think that maybe somebody votes for this motion because they might be doing the math and realizing that one of those ones that they thought wasn't scored properly, maybe now would automatically get pushed into the approval section. So I think by leaving us open to just look at all of the ones that are not recommended, we can certainly do that. But to change the scoring at this point, as the motion suggests, I think that brings. I know the word bias was used before, and I think that's a very strong word to use. But I think this may be the opposite form of bias that was intended, whereas somebody can see specifically who was not recommended and can maybe be using this motion to make sure that they are automatically recommended, just based on the existing numbers. So I would prefer that we just look at each one individually and go from there. Thank you.
Councilor Lavin?
Thank you. Well, based on the executive graphic system presentation, they almost passed. But if we were just going off your presentation, it would sound like they should have never been considered. So it sounds like you could have been the outlier. a 2019 not showing domain expenses. Domains in webs, that might not occur every year. On websites that I've bought, I buy them at years at a time. So I don't have bills every year. The scores are the scores, right? Like if all the members go through and generate a score, the average is the average because it's just math. I would think the only way to be upset about adjusting the benchmark or the line, which I think we're completely in our right to do as the final arbiter or decider here. The only reason to be upset is if you were gaming the votes. If you were adjusting your score based on a consideration other than the questions and everything at hand, based on the concept that your score would play differently with the other people's scores. Otherwise, I don't think anybody would care. If they scored a business at a 72, then it's a 72. That's that. I'm all set. Thanks.
Counselor Allenson?
So my motion doesn't address how the committee deals with the scoring. The motion simply addresses how we as a council can proceed forward. Additionally, the data is the data. It's all online. If anybody wants it and wants to check my math, I'm happy to provide it. I do not manipulate scores. I have no interest in doing so. There are some businesses that were reviewed that I agree probably should not get funding. And in those instances, the committee was pretty close in their scores of those businesses. I'm simply dealing with outliers. And when you notice a pattern on outliers, I think it's important to evaluate it and provide some insight. Again, if this is not the method by which we would like to take a second look at some and approve before we get into the nitty-gritty of all, that's fine, but I'd love to hear another suggestion.
Counselor Fishbein?
So if the process devolves into such that the body scores and then the council injects itself with manipulating the average of those scores, and then the council then takes those that are still viable and reviews them, then there's no need for the committee. So I make a motion to dissolve the committee. That's.
Yeah, there's a motion on the floor. Your motion is out of order.
Well, I understand, but that will be forthcoming once this is disposed of. This doesn't stop the scoring. If the motion passes, then this body has imposed upon itself whatever death by many cuts it has done. Still have a scoring process. You still have this deviation thing. But those people that are spending all this time on this, I know that better time can be spent on other things. So that's it. Thank you.
Counselor Tata?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as other suggestions as to how we could do this, I think I've said several times that I think we can just look at them all at the end and go from there without having to change any of the scoring component as to how we get the recommendations. So we still have that we can do. It doesn't mean that, if somebody wasn't recommended, that now they're completely done. So that would be just one other suggestion of how we could handle it. One that I would like to look at the scoring of, and Counselor Fishman, maybe you can help me out just because I don't have the portal open. The Grange, that was one that was in question. Would you, Counselor Allenson, using your motion, would that then have passed and been recommended to the council?
Yes, the low score on the Grange was 30, and the high score was 85. The standard deviation on the Grange, so the average score was a 59.60, and the standard deviation of all of those scores, which was all 10 members of the body, was 17.8. So there's essentially a bias of 17.8. So when you add that, the Grange narrowly passes by 2 points.
All right, thank you. So that, thank you for that. I apologize for not having the portal open. So that goes to my prior point. To change the score now, I think we could all see, based on that recent agenda and how the item was pulled and correspondence after that, that somebody could potentially vote right now for this motion simply to advance an application that they personally might like to see pass. And I'm certainly not saying there's anything wrong with the Grange. I think we're all aware of a situation with that one. And so I'm leery to do this, and I would suggest we don't do this, because I think that now that we already know who didn't pass or became recommended based on the current Weber scoring, to change that now could be to advance a specific entity. Thank you.
Councilor Allenson.
Ooh, I feel hot. Anybody else hot? Yes, agree. Somebody could vote for this motion to pass because of their feelings individually on the Grange. However, in my motion, I am not only talking about the Grange, I'm talking about the Grange, Zion Lutheran Church, the Hungarian Community Center. I'm also talking about 11 businesses that would fail based on the data. So to say that somebody could vote for something based on some belief that they have, somebody could also vote because they only want town projects. Somebody could also vote no on everything.
Councilor Tata, then Councilor Zandri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, that's exactly my point, is that there's, I believe you said 11 now that we've identified as not being recommended. And so I think the problem in changing the scoring at this point is that if anybody saw any of those 11 and has a feeling about them that maybe they thought they should have been advanced, they could potentially vote for this motion based on a very specific entity, as opposed to when we originally made the scoring, it was based on an overall score that everybody would be held to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Zandri.
I'd like to call the question.
So motion to call the question. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll on the motion?
Can I raise a point of order before you do that? I know it's not my place, but does that cut off public discussion, the roll call and the calling of the question?
Cuts off all debate. Cuts off all debate.
That's what?
It cuts off all debate.
Does it cut off public comment?
Yes. So, bearing that in mind, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on the motion to call the question?
Allenson?
Yes.
Carmody?
No.
Fishbein?
No.
Laffin?
Yes.
Tata?
No.
Testa? Zandri?
Yes.
Chairman Cervoni?
I vote yes, but the motion fails. Therefore, seeing no hands on the council, go to the public. Mr. Brzezinski, did you want to comment before I hear from the others?
A couple of things, if I can, and maybe I can address some of the comments you made. And in some areas, I can't be definitive, but I can be helpful, and there is a difference. But first of all, going back to how the committee was formed as sort of relevant context to some of the things that you're talking about, there was a vote by the council that each councilor would appoint a committee member. Of course, this is, old news to you, but maybe it's a reminder to the public. And the mayor also would have a pick. So it was known going in that different schools of thought would be represented. That was known. And there was also a requirement that a supermajority would be needed in order to pass everything. So when we first met and we didn't know each other, I'm talking about the ARPA committee, of course, and we didn't know each other, maybe given the the deep political divide that was, on the council or in the town, maybe temporarily on a short-term basis, some of that migrated over to the ARPA committee, but that was very short-lived. What we decided to do to get to know each other, get to know how we each think, was to honor each individual's unique perspective on each application, and to invite everybody, as sort of more than an invitation, they were drafted by me, I guess, to give their view on each application as we go around the table. And we would each take turns presenting an application. And when that got rolling, the committee was working extremely well together, and especially by averaging our scores. So we had fair and frank conversations. We began to speed up what we were doing, and the further along we got, the better it worked. And I think seeing the results that we have produced so far are results on the merits. It's not a quota system that we've adopted. We're not trying to intentionally drag more applications into the accepted category merely because there, again, some sort of a quota or expectation that more applications should be recommended. No, this is a group decision based upon the grand compromise that we made, averaging our scores, and once the average is set, if it's above the pass line, we would all agree to recommend, and if it's below the pass line, we would all agree not to recommend. That grand compromise has produced results which, on balance, are quite fair, consistent with the merits of the application. Now, to suggest that you're not passing enough is also a suggestion that, the criteria may not matter as much as the perception that you're not passing as many as you think maybe we should. So I am very proud of the work that we're doing. I think we're thorough. We share our views. And sure, we're doing this in public and on the record. And you've mentioned like outliers, but I defend everyone's right to disagree with a group. I defend everyone's right to dissent. Once in a while, a group, yes, even you, fall into group think. And if there's someone out there in our committee that has a good, solid, sound reason not to go along with group think, they're not an outlier. They're a thoughtful person. And each one of us has to present our views for what we do. So I know there's some high scores, and I know there are some low scores. I respect them all. I value them all. They're all part of the committee equally. I'm going to circle back to some other things, but I want to address a comment or thoughts and feelings by Councilor Testa. If it was humanly possible to give you an official rationale for a decision, that might be plausible, but there's 10 different rationales. Everyone has their own way of characterizing an issue, phrasing their reasons. We could never agree on one standard reason for a rejection. And in fact, in cases of rejections, many ARPA committee members pass or would want to pass but the average falls below the line. So putting together, one reason, 3 or 4 sentences is not humanly possible to do. If, however, any counselor is curious about a rejection, call me on the phone and I can give you my thoughts, at least on the basis of my score, which may coincidentally be reflective of other views in the room. I can't speak for the committee, of course. I'm just giving you my personal view on it. But usually the debates on the committee are center on the issue in the case of businesses: is there a current existing hardship or not? How do you recognize it? What's the evidence for a conclusion that it is a hardship or is not? And if there is a business that is financially fragile, was it caused by the COVID pandemic or caused by something else? Because that factors in too. So most of our time is spent on that central question, not viability of the business. So that comes up also. And the nonprofits are a little bit different, a little more complicated. I'm gonna not comment on that right now. But that's where the discussion is. So if you're curious as to what happened and why, I'll be glad to share a personal view as to what happened. But there's a reason for everything we do. Generally speaking, if an application fails, it's because it's a weak application compared to many of the others that we see that are very strong. We are very happy and very gratified when we find strong applications and we can give them a good score. We like that. We want to, all of us, want to facilitate a grant to businesses that deserve it, that need it, that fit the criteria. That makes us happy. On many occasions, individual members have said that. I'm glad to see this application. And we're not happy when an application comes in and it's weak. We wish it could be strong. But by golly, if it wasn't strong, we'll decide it on the merits, because someone has to call the balls and strikes, and you gave that job to us. So now let me go back to the central question, which is on the agenda. Item 4 is what should be our respective roles with respect to the applications that were rejected. I would suggest that if you are thinking of substituting your discretion for our discretion and starting it all from scratch, I would just hope that if you go down that path, you give due deference to the committee's work, its process, its honesty with each other, and how we've come to a decision, and give it a presumption that our decision is reasonable and squares with the criteria. And the test of reasonableness is not whether you agree. It's not whether you would come to a different result. It's whether plausibly our decision is based on the evidence and the applications we had in front of us. That's the test of reasonableness. And the test of whether or not it meets the criteria is not whether everyone is happy. Because you formed a committee with criteria to be a screening process, knowing very well that some applications would not be approved, knowing very well that those applicants would not be happy. And so this ARPA committee does a good service to you in that we get to say no and take the heat so you don't have to. That's a huge benefit to you, and it's a benefit to the community. The other benefit of the system you've set up, and I ask you not to change it now, is that we understand, and I think the community understands, that every dollar that goes to an organization, nonprofit or business, that doesn't meet the criteria or doesn't need it or doesn't deserve it is a dollar that comes out of the public treasury. It's a dollar that comes out of the pockets, you might say, or the reserves of the town of Wallingford. Therefore, we need to be careful. And we're trying like heck to be careful. And so is the town up until maybe tonight. You've hired a consultant to help you be careful. You've selected a committee so it's balanced, and we have transparency, which is a check in and of itself. We've developed a system on the ARPA committee to be as fair and frank and as honest with each other and the public as we could be. You have the comptroller's office, I've learned like yesterday, even backstopping what we do and finding things that we weren't asked to look at, and nor was a consultant. You're being careful because you're dealing with public money, and we want to be careful too, and being careful means following the criteria and not wavering from the criteria to the best of our ability for reasons that are not consistent with standards you passed and instructed us to follow.
So is our only option to approve your work? Is that our only option?
No.
Okay.
I mean,
Because I've heard a lot that says,
Yeah.
if we're not merely to approve your work, then we're not respecting your work.
what I said maybe 5 minutes ago, give due deference to what we do and give it a presumption that it's reasonable and squares with the criteria. That presumption doesn't necessarily have to be conclusive. No one is saying you don't have the power to review, but what I am suggesting that self-restraint, exercising self-restraint, is a power in and of itself. And once you open the door and you say, okay, we're going to review all these applications, what does that scene look like? You put them all on the agenda, the nonprofits and the businesses come in with their supporters and their fans and their employees, and they come to the microphone and they make their pitches. Do you want that? We protect you from that. We protect you from the influence of extraneous criteria. It's a valuable service. You disagree, I think, right?
No, I don't disagree with you.
So
That's not what I was saying.
Oh, okay.
But the volume of what I heard
Yeah.
suggests that, and I'm not trying to put words into your mouth.
Yeah, go ahead.
But the concept that we might review your work in some other way that you find disagreeable is
No.
to disrespect your work.
Then I wasn't clear, and I apologize for not being clear. Review it all you want. You have the power. But when you review it, keep in mind what has come before you, the work we've done, and afford our work, as I say, due deference. Is that so hard? And give it a presumption that our recommendation fits the criteria. Not that that presumption can't be rebutted, it can be. But if you want to start from scratch, then why have we done this? You want to start all over.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we approved 21 of your recommendations tonight.
Yeah.
I did that by quick math, so I might be off by one or two, but
Yeah. So how would this work if you're reviewing them? On what basis would you say we're overturning what the committee did? How would that, what would the discussion look like? What would the evidence look like? Would you go through the tax returns, do the analysis we do? Is that how it would work?
we might. I mean, I don't want to sound like Counselor Testa, but that's not necessarily what I'm interested in doing.
Okay.
I do appreciate the work you've done.
I'm just sort of tipping you off that going through 15 or 20 or whatever applications thoroughly is a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, and you wouldn't have the benefit of doing it in a setting such as the ARPA committee, where there are no people coming to the microphone making pitches. There aren't people there putting the pressure on you. You're not worried about being on the record and being quoted in the record journal. They don't cover our meetings really all that much. That's a huge benefit. Just think about that. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you.
You're welcome. No extra charge on that.
Yeah, no multiplier. If I might, I've got hands waving behind you and,
Take it.
okay. Mr. Ross. If all of you, when you get to the mic, just remind us who you are for the record, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Raymond Ross, and I'm here as a private citizen. I also have a letter I would like to read to you from Tammy Racchio her address is 123 Chimney Hill Road, Wallingford. This letter is written as a private citizen. March 21st, 2023. Good evening, Town Councilors. This evening you will be considering the applications of ARPA funds to various nonprofits in town. I want to bring to your attention item 3A II, Lyman Hall Music Parents Association request for $25,000. I am grateful that the committee reviewed this item and recommendation for funding the group. At the same time, it is concerning that the application from Sheehan Music Parents Association, which was on the ARPA committee agenda for March 7th, 23, is not being funded tonight after the agenda for that meeting was amended. These organizations share the same challenges during COVID and continue to provide opportunities in town for our youth. I'm an active grant reviewer for the United Way of Greater New Haven and the State of Connecticut Parents Trust Fund. Very early in my grant reviewing endeavors, I was trained to look at the spirit of the application. Several times it was necessary to overlook applications that did not have a professional grant writer but aligned with the desired impact. We considered whether the passion of the individuals applying for the grant would have helped achieve its programmatic outcomes. We needed to award funds that would support the mission and purpose of the organization to align it with the spirit and grant funds. Equity is paramount in every decision I make as a grant reviewer. Tonight, I ask that you do everything in your power to make equitable decisions for our high school music parents associations. Please ask yourself, if the music association in one high school meets the spirit of the town's distribution of ARPA funds, why don't they both? Sincerely, Tammy Racchio. Now, speaking for myself, I'm still in my 3 minutes? Okay.
30 seconds.
30 seconds, thank you. I was involved some years ago in Jazz Festival, and I took it over after the person that started it had funded it for many years. I had a good board of directors, and I had a good treasurer who wrote grants for me. We went 4 years with no grants, after which we hired a grant writer who worked on commission basis. The first year we got $200,000 in grants. I am concerned with Sheehan right now. Their prime source of income for the band is the band competitions that they run during the summer, during the fall months. This year, Sheehan, their fundraiser got rained out.
So I think they just haven't gotten to them yet.
I'm sorry?
Am I correct? No?
Sort of.
I mean, it was on an agenda, and then you changed the agenda because you wanted to wait and see what happened tonight, right?
It's on the agenda now for
Okay.
March 29, and I think I posted that on Monday, maybe, today being only Tuesday.
Yeah.
I've also had some conversations with representatives of the Sheehan Music Parents Association to let them know that, and they got a copy of the agenda.
Okay.
So March 29 is not that far off.
Yeah.
So it's going to be determined then?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it hasn't been denied. It just has to get reviewed by the committee.
Okay, the word came down to us, it had been denied.
I'm glad we clarified that for you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I got 30 seconds left next meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, math. Mr. Reynolds, I've seen your hand going for a long time.
Jesse Reynolds, 850 Old Durham Road. Full disclosure, I'm a member of the ARPA committee. You all know that. When you talk about bias, it's not quite being used appropriately. Bias refers to sort of the things that your own personal whatever can introduce into your decision making by opening up the process of the rejected applicants now and looking at them and then determining how you're going to then change the scores. That actually is bias. It's an interim look. If you do a clinical trial and you use, if you want to use statistical power to determine if a drug works, the minute you open up your data and you look at it, you lose what's called power, because now you make either a type 1 or a type 2 error. So I'm just saying, like, if you want to talk about using a standard deviation to adjust the scores, standard deviation is an element of all 10 scores itself. I'm sure you're aware of it. However, if you find that something is not normally distributed and you find that there's a problem with that, then the appropriate thing to do is to look at the median first. Look at the median and determine if the mean, meaning that it fails, differs from the median, then you can then introduce an idea about whether or not you want to adjust a score. Okay, so that's just that right off the bat. But as somebody who sits on the committee and works on all this stuff, I think, and after hearing Attorney Small's sort of description of the process moving forward, I don't necessarily think that anyone would have a problem with going through the ones that were rejected and looking at it again, but I would suggest that you do it after we're done. Because when you start influencing the behavior of the committee by overturning what we do, you're now de facto introducing bias into our decisions. Like if you find that somebody scores something too low now, and then you adjust those scores, what do you think the response would be if you think that their scores are actually being influenced by their own beliefs? We all know what passes and we all know what fails. And so when we look at these applications, we determine the scores based on the pass-fail threshold. The first chunk of the criteria that you give us are the two largest chunks. You put 30 points onto whether or not they describe what they're actually going to do, and then can they actually do it in a year. The remaining 70 points of your score falls into, do they experience a hardship, and are they able to do something with the money that they're going to get? That's a hugely subjective thing that you ask a person to be able to ascertain from a very brief application, a bunch of tax forms, and maybe some backup information. So that's why your scores do vary. Some people tend to be harder on applications. Some people tend to be not as hard. But in general, as Chairman Burdinsky pointed out, we all vote in majority at the end because we agree with what the group has come to as a decision at the end. And that's the point. You have all the power to change whatever. It's, you know, the mayor can bring it to you and you can fund it if you want to. But the whole point in it is that you should let us finish and then make the determination as to what you want to do with it. But otherwise, you are introducing bias into your decision making, you're introducing bias into our decision making, and that's where bias actually comes into play. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gross?
Debbie Gross, Long Hill Road. When you looking at this, you have to remind yourselves that these are federal funds, and there's criteria that was set by the federal government to administer these funds. And the committee's done obviously a great job in getting to a certain point to provide you with information. And I understand if you want to look back at their information to say if it was viable or not. But you'd also have to look at, like Mr. Burdinsky said, the information, what was there, what were they missing? Was it the tax returns? Does it really fit the criteria? Because if you're not in compliance with the federal government. And so to arbitrarily add a standard deviation to someone's score is really kind of copping out and really not doing fiscal responsibility to the town, because you're adding a number to a score that they came up with and you're passing them. But if you peeled back everything and looked at the information, maybe they should have passed, and that's your discretion, but maybe they shouldn't have. But to look at it, to add something to a score to pass somebody, in my opinion, is wrong.
Mr. Mira?
Good evening. Joe Mira, Economic Development Commission. A few quick notes. We talked about, someone mentioned fair, and I agree, but I got to take into question, was it fair to the nonprofits who filed their applications in October for a certain amount to find out that the amount was raised by this council in November for the closing date? I don't know if that was fair. As for the storefronts downtown, I know that's an old battle cry, but I'm searching my mind, and I don't see many vacant stores out there. But to get to the point of this meeting, perspective, and this is something we got to keep into mind. Is there a deadline on when this committee can be finished reviewing the apps? No.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. And it took this council, I guess, 11 months, and I don't know, a couple of weeks, before you put it out for the applications for the small businesses, right? And when we did put it out, we put it out middle of October, which in most businesses is beginning in the middle of the busiest time of the year for these small businesses. October, November, and December. Okay? So now you're taking a small business, you're telling him or her or them, here's what you need to do, get it done, get it over with, let's go. And meanwhile, they're still trying to feed their families, they're still trying to pay their rent, they're still trying to make their mortgage payments, and we're hitting them with this. So the council takes 11 months to put it together. The commission has an open-ended, the committee has an open-ended date to analyze them, and we're penalizing them because I's are not dotted and T's are not crossed. If there's things missing, I think there should be a reasonable time to ask these people to bring it up. And those two applications you mentioned, I mean, I'm sorry, I think both of them should have been approved, because if you know anything about the internet, that printing company, to me, was nothing more than a growth business. You don't need a website to start a business. You have businesses out there where you join into their website. So this person probably went from those to his website, and now he's getting a brick and mortar. So I don't see the problem there. And as far as the other person goes, again, think of his business. Think of the busy time of the year. Of course, he or she could not have dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. That's not their background. I think you said it was a meat market or a grocery store. That's their background. You want to ask them what their inventory was on Tuesday as opposed to Thursday? I bet you they can give you item for item. Okay? So I think we got to really put things into perspective when we're looking at these apps. I think the committee's doing a fair job. I think they're doing a good job. But I think when you really look at it and you really start to be business consultants, you really got to look at the time of the year that you put these people through to fill them out. Thank you.
Mr. Conroy?
Bruce Conroy, Burke Heights Drive. So I just wanted to make kind of clear, everything that went to the ARPA Commission passes the federal standards, correct?
We have a consultant.
Is that what the consultant's for?
Yeah.
I heard a no behind me, but, you know, I'm not talking to them, I'm talking to you. That was what I was understood, that it went to the commission, it passed the consultant, that means it meets with the federal guideline.
That's a fair statement, yes.
There's some confusion, though, that needs to be cleared up. Merely because it complies with federal ARPA does not mean it complies with a local criteria.
That's not what I asked.
Okay.
And what was stated a little bit ago was that some of them didn't follow federal guidelines. I know that, I'm sure, you know, Mike, you know all the local ones that you guys put in. I'm not going to argue about that, okay? But the statement I just said was, everything passes the federal guidelines. You all said yes. Otherwise, it wouldn't have passed our consultant that we paid. I think that Councilor Allenson's motion is a good one. I also think that Councilor Tada's was probably the best one. Just give the money to the public, and there are no arguments. Also, I do also agree with her that nothing should have been approved until they were all looked at. You could approve them, you could look at them in batches and approve them after. But they really, just for fairness sake, it should wait till the end, until everybody's looked at. Because otherwise, you'd get 3/4 of the way through and run out of money. What happens to the rest of them? It could happen, right? Theoretically, how could it not?
The council's approved funding based upon the total number of applications and the amount applied for. So,
So you'll have extra left over if we don't approve the ones that you didn't approve?
That's where it's headed.
Right, now, okay. I'm just clarifying. Thank you very much.
Yep.
So Counselor Allison's just fills the quota. I mean, that means that everybody that applied got money allocated to them.
No, it doesn't. There are still applications that got denied by the committee that would not be approved as a result of Counselor Allison's motion.
And their money would be left over.
It would, yeah.
All right. But it wouldn't be that many, would it? I do agree that hers is the fairest at the moment, barring not giving money to everybody and wait until the end. That is a great way to do it because it does give people a little bump. If you're close, hey, what the hell? Are there ones on there that I think should pass? Yeah. And I think that the recommendation of any commission is a recommendation to the council. I don't think you all need shielding from the public. I mean, you don't need shielding from me, and I mean, I've been on the other side of you a few times. But I think Counselor Allison's suggestion is a good one, and hopefully you all support it.
Mr. Gross.
Bob Gross, Longfield Road. Make a declaration. I am also a member of the ARPA committee and show no bias to any application. Go into them looking at them all based on the merits. And I would think that if you asked anybody in the room, I think that pretty much all of us do that. It's the merits that do it. And there was a comment just made about if it passed UHY, it must be ARPA approved. It's not. We have an application coming up that is a business here in town, but was not started until mid-2019. You had to be in business in 2019, the whole year, to be eligible for ARPA. It got through them because of the way their application was written. The only reason it was found was because when you look at their tax returns, you see that there was nothing for 18. Normally you'll see on a tax return 18, 19, 20. It compares years. It compares what they have in inventory and that type of thing. There was nothing for 18. Why wasn't there anything for 18? What were they looking? Why wasn't there anything there? You go looking, they weren't in business. They didn't start till 19. So that's something I hope that you guys, because that's the way it's going, will do that deep dive and find it. Because this business isn't even registered in Connecticut. It's registered in Wyoming. So do they have that? I mean, they're not looking that carefully for it. They're not looking at the Secretary of State for their business application. We're doing that. And that one could potentially not pass, even though, based on its numbers, looks like it should pass. But it wasn't in business all in 19. So it shouldn't pass, because it doesn't meet ARPA. And a few of those applications that you have there don't meet ARPA. But based on what somebody said earlier on how the grid goes, can they do this by 2024? Yes. So you give them a high score because they can do it. Is it a worthwhile project? Yes, it is. Can they, so they get some points that way, but they lose it on the other parts. And that's and some people don't score it that way. Some people do score it that way. Some of the ones that you potentially could go through with the standard deviation, one of them really wouldn't make it. There was no returns. There was no tax returns for it. So if you go based on your own qualifications, some of these applications that we fail are based on what you set as criteria, not what we set as criteria. You set the criteria. We didn't. We have the criteria. Some of it can't be used to pay salaries, past bills that are owed. They come in and that's all they ask for, to pay some bills. So they get a low score there by some of us because that's what you said to do. To be for a project. But some of those scored still close. So based on the standard deviation, you're going to pass them, even though they don't meet your criteria. And it's unfair to businesses that did not apply. That thought, well, yeah, I don't meet that criteria, but then you're going to pass some that did. And this goes back to Counselor Tata, winners and losers. That's what you're doing here. We're picking the winners and losers based on the information that was given to us. and the UHY has gone back and asked for revised paperwork. Somebody might have redacted too much information on their taxes. They might have forgot to send a form. They've added them because I've made note of when they come in the portal. Why have they come in after the date? Well, they've come in because UHY has made the attempt to get additional information from some of these, whether they were tax-exempt organizations or businesses, and they provided it. Doesn't mean they pass or don't pass, but it was after the date. That's also an issue, too, because you cut it off December 9th. Really wasn't going to speak, but that's some of that. Some of this, you say, has to be affected by COVID or affected by it. Well, when you look at some of these applications that you're going to review, make sure you remember what your standards were, because we do. We go through it, and we go around the room, and there's 10 of us in there. And it's not spirited. There's a member on the committee. If you listen to, I think it's March 7th's audio, we don't have video, you will hear the discussion around the table. From all, I think there's close to, and I think there were 9 there that night. And the discussion was how well the group is working together. Both sides, political aisles, based on who you've appointed. Both sides, they're from EDC to just citizens of this town of Wallingford. But everybody there has what's best in mind for the town of Wallingford. And to change things now is just wrong. That's my opinion. But I know you could override some of these applications, and that's not an issue. But if you override it, make sure you do it for the right reason. Don't just do it because somebody up there wants one of these entities passed. So you come up with the standard deviations the way, okay, oh, this way will work. That's not fair. Thank you.
And we're over time for public comment.
Mr. Chairman.
Attorney Small.
I just want to say because it's been said many times, it's not an override. You're not overriding their good work. They are making recommendations to you and the mayor of what should be approved, and the final decision, as you from the very beginning reserved for yourselves, is yours. So I do agree, you should be giving them, some deference. You should be paying attention to what their rationales were and look at their minutes, watch their meetings if you want. But it is, in the end, a recommendation, and you're not overriding. It's not a decision that they made. They're making a recommendation to you. So I just, because it's been used several times, I just think it's the wrong word. That's all.
Thank you. Councilor Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Conroy's point about the money, potentially running out. So because of what we allocated, there's no fear of that. However, how that might happen, one thing I've been concerned about recently is there are deadlines that the federal government put in place. So we're obligated to, the money must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and spent by December 31st, 2026, or it goes back to the federal government, as long as those dates haven't changed since the last time I checked. So if we did take too long, there is that risk that could happen. So if the committee took too long, or we took too long to act on the committee's recommendations, or like what the plan is, to use whatever money we don't give to these applicants on town projects, if that's not obligated by December 31st, 2024, there is a chance that the federal government could come and take that money back. So I just wanted to bring that up, that we do have deadlines for this. And another thing I just wanted to bring up, and Mr. Brudzinski, I hate to ask your committee to do something else, especially tonight, but you might want to consider this. I've heard this several times, and it came up again tonight, that possibly some of what the consultant has been, either the advice that they've given to some, or certain things getting through that they say meet the federal guidelines, and then the committee finds out later they don't. If maybe the committee might just be able to make a list of any of those concerns and maybe give it to us, that might be helpful, because I've heard I kind of keep hearing things like that, and I'm concerned that we're paying the consultant a large amount of this money, and I want to make sure that if something's going amiss, that we all are aware of that. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Can I clarify that there was some frustration, especially in the beginning, that the consultant passed applications to us labeled complete, and yet they were not in some cases because they didn't have tax returns when they were required. So it's matters of that ilk. That's all that comes to mind as examples right now. That's all it was. But we handled that internally, and you've gotten reports from us as to what we have not recommended because they're not complete in our view, but were complete in the consultant's report or something.
And one of the other complaints that I had heard was that for certain applicants, the consultant contacted them to let them know they were missing documents, and with other applicants, the consultant did not contact them, and so they were automatically never recommended to you. Do you know, have you heard about?
Can't address that.
I know you wouldn't know because you would have never seen them, but that is another complaint I heard from a few. So I just want to make sure that if there's things going wrong with the consultant, that everybody's made aware so we can address that. Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. One, the consultants is in this meeting, but two, if an application was not complete, if the document wasn't complete, some people didn't sign them, some people left half of it blank, those people would not get a call saying you're missing documents. But a large percentage, and I think Claire probably could speak to it, of applicants who did complete the form didn't provide all the documentation. Those people were contacted to do that. If you were to decide that they shouldn't have been allowed to get those documents in after they filed the completed form portion of it, then there is I think a rather large number of these applications that would in fact be denied if they hadn't done that. So, but if you didn't reach that point of finishing the application, the form itself, and left half of it blank, and some of them looks like they may have started to apply and then decided not to finish it, they didn't get calls. I mean, most of these applications came in at the last minute. So at that point, if you haven't even finished half of the form, we're not going to contact you after the deadline and say, you left half of the form out. You basically would be asking them to fill out an entire application again. So that's the distinction between who did it. Now, one of the reasons this is on the agenda is because those people haven't gotten an official notice that they're done. And that's why I'm asking you, do you wish to see the ones that didn't go any farther? And that's the next agenda item. That's the whole purpose of that. So somebody may say to you, nobody emailed me and told me to give you information. That may very well be accurate. But they're on that list of forms that were never completed, and you have to decide if you wish to see all those. The consultant is prepared to put them all in a package for you, all to see. And that's why that's on the agenda tonight. Because I'm looking to bring it to a finality so those people could be notified one way or the other.
If we were to do that, that's going to increase the dollar amount, correct? Because the dollar amount we set was only based on applications that came through.
I have to double check that. I'm not sure. I gotta double check that.
Okay. Yeah, I believe so. I believe the dollar amount was only what actually came through. So then we'd have to think about that too. And I understand this is probably moving on to the next agenda item.
Yeah, and it would really be essentially allowing them to fill out the whole thing at this point in time in most of those cases, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Fishbein?
Not all applications have been complete to other extent. I can think of a couple that, one of the portion that we asked the applicant to sign off on is that they agree to sign a contract, be in compliance with the laws, all of that stuff. And it's just a simple yes or no. And we've had applications that they didn't check either box. Now that's of concern to me. However, the body itself has decided that we would still review those applications and score accordingly. I mean, I think that's an integral part of the application process, and it's merely a yes or no. I have to question, though, what that review procedure is going to look like. You know, we already had someone come to the microphone tonight and partially advocate for an application. I think I mean, the committee, the way it operates is we allow applicants or their representatives to come and, you know, be in the room while we talk about their application, but they can't interject. Anybody who's tried to call me on the phone to talk about an application, I'm like, no, I can't talk about this, because then if I bring that information to the body, I think that's inappropriate and unethical. You're coming outside of the four corners of the application. So, you know, on one plane, am I to foresee that after the application review committee makes its determinations, and it apparently there was no problem in approving tonight. I don't know that anybody reviewed any of those applications to see up here to see if there was any concerns with those approvals. I would hope that there would be some sort of review on rejections. Are we to expect a representative from the ARPA committee to be here at the table advocating on behalf of the committee to explain why, so that we take that into consideration? Also, are we to anticipate the room to be filled with, you know, in the instance that we heard about tonight, Sheehan music parents, you know, advocating for their application? You know, if that's what this process is going to devolve into, I don't think that's the intent. What I don't know, since, you know, the door was opened up a little bit tonight, you know, how, if we're saying to the public, it doesn't matter what the committee does, you can just come and plead to the council, it frustrates the purpose. So, concerned about where we are. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilor Testa. Councilor Laffin.
Thank you. Well, just like a court case, there's an appeal or a possible next step. It's just a secondary, this would just be a secondary review that we'll talk about. And maybe it's just so we understand better why they didn't pass out of the consultant group or not. The review procedure, of course, is a process to be determined by the council. I think first we just need an agreement, a vote on that we want to do that, because we haven't done that yet either. I'm not concerned about introducing a new bias with this motion tonight, because if they weren't biased in the first place, it shouldn't change anything. If we see a swing in the numbers, then that would indicate there was a bias, and that would be a greater concern, a greater problem. Because if you're dealing with your own scores, your own and only your score, then it should not impact the overall score with this measuring metric. It would only be with working with the other scores and, you know, multiple people saying, well, if we all grade at this level, then one of us gets knocked off, but the other two are okay. And I don't think that's happening now, so I don't expect that to happen in the future either. Thanks.
Councilor Carmody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Councilor Allenson on her thoughtfulness and creativity with this motion. But I do think that a few points were made in the audience that we really should wait to make such a decision until the work of the committee is complete. And so I'd like to move to table this until the work of the committee is done.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion to table? Councilor Testa.
I would just echo what Councilor Carmody said. In fact, I especially was impressed by the comments of Mr. Reynolds. I'm always impressed by the comments of Mr. Reynolds, but that's beside the point. made a very good point, and I haven't changed my mind that I would like to reserve the right to reconsider certain applications, but he made a very good case for us holding off, and that makes sense, and I think that it's part of the give and take I'd like to see between both of our groups. So I support the motion to hold off on this. It's respectful of Councilor Allison's motion. It's certainly going to be considered again if we do table it, but I think it might be best if we wait till all of the applications have been reviewed and then look at all of them then at that time. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on the motion to table?
Allenson? No. Carmody?
Yes.
Fishbein?
Yes.
Laffin?
No.
Tata?
No.
Testa?
Yes.
Zandri?
No.
Chairman Cervoni?
No. The motion fails. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on the motion on the table? Or being considered, rather?
Will we be able to hear the motion again, Mr. Chairman? I'd like to make a motion for the council to approve all current and future applications that have an average score plus 1 standard deviation of the individual scores, which will vary by request. If others, oh, that's it, sorry. I did say if others agree, I am happy to collect the data and provide it to the council for verification and to make these approvals.
Chairman, who for the record seconded that?
Mr. Laffin.
Councilor Laffin.
Allenson?
Yes.
Carmody?
Yes.
Fishbein?
No.
Laffin?
Yes.
Tata?
No.
Testa?
Yes.
Zandri?
I'm going to be in support of this, but I'm going to also do the same thing that Councilor Fishbein did earlier, because there's one item of conflict. So while I'm supporting the motion, I am recusing myself and abstaining for anything that affects the Wallingford Grange.
Chairman Cervoni?
Yes. So the motion passes. On to item 5, regarding applications not forwarded to the ARPA committee by UHY. Please, Attorney Small.
So you have a group of those applications, and, you know, if they're not, I'm not recommending that you do that. I'm just telling, we're at a point where if they were not forwarded onto the committee, and we should really, if nothing further is going to happen, they should all be notified. So I need the consultant is prepared to create a means for you to see all those if you wish to see them before you make a decision as to whether or not it's final or not, or to give you some type of further report breaking them down, maybe by category. It's up to you how you want to proceed on that, but I do think we should come to some conclusion on those.
Yeah, I think that before we decide how we're going to handle them, I'd like to see what's there and get a handle on why they haven't been forwarded.
All right, then we'll work on putting that together.
I don't speak for
well,
everyone.
I'm sorry, assuming the full council agrees with you. We'll work on putting that together. We'll need to do some work to do that, but it won't be too long.
Councilor Laffin? Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, just who applied and why they didn't pass on, I guess, in the report.
Do you want that as a report per item, or do you actually want to see the documents of each one? Do it either way, it's up to you.
Because the documents are not on that website, correct?
They're not on the portal, right? So they would have to put those together, or do you want to report on each one as to what was, you just want to see them?
I think having access to them is probably not going to hurt anything. But
Okay, all right.
Scan them all in one giant document and...
Well, however they do it.
Right.
I will get that to you.
That's my preference anyway, sorry.
I didn't realize the council hasn't decided that.
Councilor Testa?
Just to clarify, so these never even made it to the committee.
Correct.
Okay, so we're not
Correct.
speaking about, okay.
So there'll be some that will be clearly not eligible under the federal rules, and you'll see that. That's what it will say. You'll see some that are just absolutely not finished in any way. So we'll work on putting that together for you, and you can all take a look at it and go from there.
Councilor Tata?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to jump back for a second. I'm not sure that we addressed agenda item 4 fully, because it was discussion and possible action regarding whether to give further consideration to applications not recommended by the ARPA committee. So the vote passed to change the scoring, which will allow more recommendations to come before us that the committee didn't recommend, but now based on the new scoring, we'll get more. But there's still going to be a bunch that are not recommended because they fall under the new scoring. So what are we to do with those?
I think it's pretty clear that the council reserved the right to review those.
Okay. And then I assume the same thing for 5. So we're just going to, we're going to review all of them, basically.
We'll be allowed to.
All right, now I'm confused. Because I thought that this system of looking at the scores was going to actually be done by this body, not by the committee.
No.
Oh, I misunderstood?
That's clear. It's
okay.
going to be.
If I may, you're not going to get more recommendations. We're going to recommend based on our same old system. And you guys are going to adjust whatever you adjust.
Yeah, we're not changing what you do.
Right. I just, because there
that's
was some
clear.
confusion, you're getting the same amount of recommendations we would give you in any event. And then you would tinker with them.
Different word, but yeah.
That's my word.
Okay.
Use the bias up here.
Yeah, you'd wipe out my bias. That's what you'd do.
Yeah. All right. So are we clear on 4 and 5?
Yes, thank you.
And on to item 6, which is Attorney Small's memo of March 15th.
So there's a couple of items. In number 3, I did tell you that there were 2 business applications that did not properly or correctly report their funding, federal funding. And, you know, the committee chairman was concerned about that, as can be understandable. I did inquire of both businesses whether or not their funding was accurate, and as shown on the federal website. One responded that, in fact, that they hadn't received additional funds. The other one has not responded, and I'm frankly not going to chase it if they don't want to respond. So it would seem to me that those would be denied for having the incorrect information, but that's up to you.
Didn't we say in the application that you sign under penalties of
Correct.
perjury and I think by not prosecuting them for perjury and merely rejecting their application, we're probably being kind enough. I don't know. I don't speak for everyone. Councilor Testa? I did read that hand signal, right?
Yes, I think, yeah. I wasn't waving, saying yes, sue them. I wanted some clarification on the whole idea of the 501c8s.
We're on our way.
We're not there yet.
That's next.
Okay.
Councilor Fishbein?
I just point out that I did ask to have some sort of certification. We ended up with a certification as opposed to the perjury language. So I had said that people don't represent all the time what is accurate on their application, and told you so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome for that opportunity. Anyone else on the incorrect responses? All right, on to 501c8s.
So I can take it, I can tell these people their applications are rejected?
I think
Okay.
yes.
All right, so 501c8s, they're, you know, frankly, the Treasury Department does not include that in their definition of nonprofit. It really can't be any clearer than that, and there's no basis for a 501c8 or any of the other 501cs not included in the definition to assert that it is in a that it has some kind of business function that allows them to apply under the federal rules. Sorry, it's really as clear. It's really as simple as that.
Yes, this is Counselor Testa's.
Yeah, the second part of what you just said, I think answered my question. I think. There are federal laws or guidelines or whatever, laws that say if someone is a 501c8, they cannot present themselves as a
The
business.
Treasury has defined what a nonprofit is under ARPA.
Okay.
And it only includes C3s and C19s.
Got that.
Between the interim rule and the final rule, it's clear from their comments that various groups asked for that definition to be expanded, and the Treasury chose not to do so.
Right.
So that's it. That's where you got to be in order to be a nonprofit under this program.
Correct. Understood. But you went further and said they also indicated
Well,
that they wouldn't be able to then apply as a business. Was that?
because they're not. That's,
I didn't remember if we talked about that in the past or not.
Yeah, that was because somebody raised that. You know, why can't we file a business application? Because you're not a business, you're a 501c8. That's the answer.
From the Treasury Department or from us?
Well, that's my answer from looking at the Treasury's Department's narrow definition of what a nonprofit is.
Right.
Unless somebody presents a legal argument that someone who is a nonprofit under some other section can then claim it is a business under ARPA, I know of no such argument that can be made.
I mean, I'm thinking of an organization in town, clearly. And because they're part of a national overriding organization, it's not the Elks, but say it could be the Elks. Right? In other words, we have a local Elks and there's national Elks. Well, this is a local.
I'll use the word chapter, I'm not sure that's right, but it doesn't make it any
Right.
less a fraternal organization.
Right. And then but he said they filed 99 or
They file a 990.
990.
And I even asked them, do you file, I forgot what the form is, for unrelated income. They do file the report, they didn't have any, but that still wouldn't, that's a separate requirement that the IRS makes, and I'm not an IRS expert.
Right.
That doesn't get you out of the 501c8 category. You still are what you are.
What are you?
501c8.
We already know they're not a nonprofit. But
No, they're not.
So what
They're
are
under the nonprofit
Right, we know the
IRS statute. They are not under the nonprofit definition that the U.S. Treasury has created for purposes of being qualified to apply for ARPA. For ARPA. This is all about ARPA.
But for IRS, they're still considered.
They're a nonprofit.
They're
That
still a
doesn't change,
nonprofit.
or they fall into that statute.
Yeah.
But that's not what the Treasury wants to give the money to.
And what is this 990?
That's the tax return on nonprofit files.
Type?
Yeah.
Refresh me on
Yeah.
that one.
I only learned that because I had a tax appeal that involved them, so.
So they're an organization in that, I'm sorry, an organization of that type they're just ruled out from the beginning.
Yeah,
They
that was
can't even
it.
they don't get through the consultant, they don't get to the committee. They're
Right.
just, they're not allowed.
Correct. That's what the U.S. Treasury decided. Like I said, there were actually other 501c organizations. I didn't see this particular one in there that tried to get that definition expanded as they were developing the final rule, and the Treasury decided not to do that.
Mhm.
They decide who's a nonprofit for purposes of applying for an ARPA grant.
Understood. All right. Do you recall any fraternal organizations that were not classified as 501c8s that came through? Do you recall any? You didn't see any, right?
Don't recall any.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Anyone else? Profit and loss statement.
All right, the profit and loss statement, so you may recall that you required either the tax returns or CPA-issued profit and loss statements. The consultant accepted profit and loss statements that did not specifically state that it came from a CPA. The committee initially heard one where they did approve the grant where that was the case, but then made a decision that they would not do that going forward. They would not recommend those because it was not clearly indicated that it was issued by a CPA. So there are numerous ones that fall into this category, and if Claire is still on the call, then she can address, why she viewed it to pass through. But I just, I think for the committee we just need a final decision as to, is that fine the way it is or not? I think that when I wrote the memo there, I found 3 that fell into that category. I'm not sure if I counted it right, but I believe that there's a couple of more from this past meeting that would fall into that category.
Councilor Laffin.
Thank you. My preference would be to ask them to clearly indicate, and if that's not possible, my preference again would be to allow them to then submit one that a CPA is stamped for approval or whatever, or give them a chance like, oh, you got it. It's basically they didn't check a box, and that could have been very accidental. I'd hate to throw the whole thing out because they missed one little component, just like the other one, which was not clearly indicated but approved. It could be a very viable or very worthy application. I would like to give those applicants the chance to correct the oversight. I don't know how the other councilors feel.
Councilor Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is why I didn't want to vote to approve any of these until at the very least at the end of this meeting, if not until the end of the entire process, because now it looks like the committee approved one application that did not clearly indicate that it was issued by a CPA. They then decided they would not act on any application that did not clearly indicate the profit and loss statements were issued by a CPA. So we approved that one tonight then? The one that's referred to?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's a problem then, I think, because now we're trying to decide what qualifies and what doesn't. We already approved one. I don't know what the answer is. This is very messy, to say the least. Thank you.
Councilor Testa.
Well, to potentially answer that question, doesn't the memo indicate, absent further direction from you, such applications will not be reviewed by the committee? So if we determine that that was in some way unfair, we could direct the committee to reconsider those, given that there are 3. We could, I'm saying, right? Would we not do that?
I think
and
so.
They would say, oh, okay, it's your decision, we will be happy to do that, or not. I mean, there is a way out of this.
Yes.
If we felt that there was
Mr. Chairman, I believe that was directed at me. May I respond? Yeah. Well, I think we'd still be in the one that we approved, I think we'd still have an issue with. Because then what, do we unapprove that one? So I don't think we do have a way out. Unless we say, do look at all of these other ones, but the one that's already approved. So basically we would have to make it so that they're all looked at, as opposed to the one that we already approved getting unapproved. And I'm not even sure which one it is, to be honest, but.
Councilor Fishbein.
Ergo the problem. So I think when that application came before us, one of the criteria that this body gave to the it's not a subcommittee, gave to the ARPA review application committee was to look at various aspects of the application. I think what we did with regard to that application is we scored it accordingly because they didn't have the appropriate documentation. So, you know, when we look at scores and we make allegations of bias, that was part of what was that particular review. I would expect that we're just talking about business applications though, right? Because I believe we had one nonprofit application that came before us that, you know, they've all got 990s, otherwise you're a nonprofit without filing paperwork. I believe with regard to that application, they submitted P&Ls that didn't have a CPA, but still, even if there was a P&L for a nonprofit, we're requiring 990s. So I guess question with regard to this procedure, we're just talking about the businesses. We're not looking to change anything with regard to the nonprofits and saying, you know, we don't care about your 990s. The lowest the lowest threshold is a P&L that you just created.
So this is item 5 in the memo, and it starts with the business program.
Okay, well, I will tell you, I believe we did run into one nonprofit that we put into that category because it didn't have a 990. It was a nonprofit. It had a P&L, if I recall correctly, but I defer for the purposes of where we are right now.
You seem to be bristling, Mr. Brudzinski. Can we help you?
Yes, you can. Just some context to what happened here. So I think this is one of the first night, or maybe the first night that we met. And when we came across this application that didn't have tax returns, there was a lot of consternation as how this could have happened to us. How could it be that the council required tax returns, your criteria, and the consultant let it get to us without those required tax returns? It's the first time that happened, and it resulted in a lengthy discussion of how to deal with this. At that particular time, we said, you know what, we'll take that into account when we score. And to our surprise, it passed without tax returns. Thereafter, it was recognized as something that should not have happened. And we made a policy thereafter, no tax returns, it goes back to you to do whatever you want. But in that discussion, it lasted over 2 separate meetings, tax returns were deemed absolutely critical. That was unanimous. Different committee members had different remedies as to what we should do, but everyone agreed we need tax returns in order to properly assess the claims of the nonprofits. So then we adopted the policy dealing with businesses only.
I don't think that was the council's requirement. I don't think.
It was in the application.
But I thought there was an or. It was.
No.
Yeah, it was a tax return
CPA,
or.
thank you. CPA issued or tax returns.
CPA issued profit and loss.
Yeah, profit
or
and
tax
loss
return.
or tax returns.
Right.
So in this example that I'm talking about, it clearly was not a CPA issued profit and loss. It was a QuickBooks kind of a thing. And so thereafter, we said for businesses only, we have this policy, no tax returns or CPA issued profit and loss. It goes back to you.
Who's next? Then you're next, Councilor Allenson.
So, taking the committee's judgment into consideration, then since they've put several items, it's 5 now as of the 16th, back to us for less than required documentation, I just think that we should give them the opportunity, I don't know if the submissions were, maybe it was unclear that it had to be a CPA issued profit and loss somehow. Maybe the consultant was unclear on that. This is fine, but if, we're already going to be reviewing others, I would say give them the opportunity to submit what's missing to us, and we can always review it. And, you know, based on the committee's judgment so far, you know, so one got through, it's not the end of the world. They will have to provide documentation as they go along through their project to, you know, verify that they're spending the money on the right things and all of this. So I would say, let's just get the documents and not belabor the point, which is we can consider these like a rejection, right? And then we have the ability to review them. So let's get the documents and review them.
Councilor Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully disagree with the statement that it's not the end of the world. I think, I'm not a lawyer, there are lawyers up here, but I mean, could this potentially open us up for a lawsuit that somebody was approved for federal money through our town government that did not meet the standard? We admitted at a public meeting they did not meet the standard, but then we're going to say, well, that one just got through. Now what happens to the ones who we maybe decide didn't meet the criteria and that one happened to get through? So I'm still unsure as to what we do with the one that we already approved.
Well, Councilor Testa suggested we could solve that by allowing the other ones to be considered. And I don't disagree with him.
Okay, I do disagree with that, but
I understand that.
I'm one of all of us. But I do disagree. I don't think we lower the standards because we made an oopsies, and now we're gonna lower the standard for the rest of them to make up for the admitted mistake. Thank you.
Councilor Testa.
Well, I am curious. Until tonight, nothing had been approved, like authorized for funding, right? I mean, you would, what prevented you from going back, once you realized this error, what prevented you from going back and saying, whoops, had you already told them you guys are good? It's not like we then authorized it. I'm just wondering, why weren't you able to backtrack?
I think I understand your question. Let me give it a shot, and if,
Yeah.
and if I didn't.
Appreciate it.
That night came and went, and notices went out that the application was approved. It was a case of first impression, caused a lot of trouble, you know, a lot of, you know, why did the consultant put us in this impossible position? And frankly, we thought we had it solved by saying it'll wash out in the scoring, but it didn't. And it took it really until the next meeting till we figured this can't happen again.
Well,
So that's the history of it. That's
But
the truth.
so a notice did go out to the applicant.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
Oh, that's what I'm getting at. So
Yeah.
there was an approval giving, yeah.
When you get your notices from me,
Yeah.
all the applicants get it too.
Right.
I email them the agendas, I email them the reports, and that's their notice of our official action. So it goes out like 2 or 3 days later.
I appreciate that, thank you. And my question to Councilor Allenson, the point you made, when you say we could get the documentation, it sounds to me like, well, what documentation are you talking about? Because it sounds to me like these other three, there are at least three, they came in with profit and loss statements that were not issued by CPAs. So what?
Well, it doesn't say that. So the consultant forwarded on, because they are, when you sign the application, you're certifying that you've given everything, or you've done everything that the town's required you to do.
Right.
That's why they were forwarded on from the consultant to the committee. But the documents itself doesn't have a stamp of a CPA on it. I mean, you could simply say, if you were so inclined, they could get a question from me, was it issued by a CPA and who was it? Or I don't know, I'm just trying to think about this, but, and I think, at least in the first discussion, and maybe, when I was reading the minutes, I thought some of the discussion was there were some on the committee who I'm going to use the word interpret it, to have possibly come from a CPA, but I think you can extract the data off of, I don't know, whatever programs they use. I don't know. I'm not an expert on taxes and whatnot. But clearly, the documents themselves do not have a stamp of any CPA.
But these are applications that did not make it to the committee because...
No, they did go to the committee.
So they did get to you?
Yes.
Okay. After you determined, okay, wait.
No, so the consultant deemed them sufficient to forward on to the committee. The committee looks at them and says, where's the CPA?
Right.
Name on it, stamp on it, I don't know what they do. And that's why the committee has decided, well, it's supposed to be issued by a CPA. It doesn't say it's issued by a CPA. So we're not gonna forward those as recommended. So that's why the issue is here is, are we to do anything else if...
Then I fully understand that, which gets me to my question, what documentation might you have been referring to, Counselor, when you said we could get, see what I'm saying?
If they're...
We already have it. We already have what they gave us.
Right, so if the contention is that we want tax returns and profit and loss, why not just ask for it?
No, your application said tax returns or.
Right.
But the or is a CPA-issued profit and loss. They have profit and loss statements that don't specifically say it came from a CPA. So I get why the committee says, well, wait a minute, who issued this? That didn't say that. So I'm reporting to you that there are a number of applications in that category. And if there's, what are we supposed to do with it? That's why I'm here.
Because if we went back to these folks and said, all right, we're past the deadlines, but we'll give you a chance to correct your application and get us a profit and loss issued by a CPA, that would be wonderful, but then they're no longer in this category that we're talking about. And which the problem facing us is, do we give the 3 or 4 businesses that gave us a profit and loss that wasn't issued by a CPA consideration? That's the question. It does not allow for further documentation, or they would then be in a different category.
I mean, it doesn't say it came from a CPA. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it possibly could. I don't
I mean,
know.
let's just know the question we're trying to answer here. That's the question.
If I may, we have a lot of applications for businesses that have tax returns. Every business has to file a tax return. Providing a tax return is cheaper, faster than going back to your CPA. So the out is, if you want to go down this path, get us the tax returns. Seems to me that's the more practical way of doing it.
But that removes those people from this category.
Then you have to figure out, do we
still have
decide
the
it or
issue
you
of-
decide it?
We
'Cause it
still
has to
have
be
the issue of, we approved one, you know. Right.
We can always pull back.
I'm all for allowing these people to correct their mistake. If we've discovered what it is, and they're able to correct it, and they're past the deadline, and we say to them, hey, you didn't make it, we stopped it because you didn't fulfill this. But we're willing to give you the opportunity to correct it and get yourself within the guidelines. I'm okay with that, unless people are objecting to that.
Is that a motion?
No,
Okay,
no, not yet.
just checking.
Not yet. No, I mean, let's hear what everybody wants to do.
Counselor Fishbein.
So, really, this is not us with either hat that I wear. It's not this body, and it's not that body. It's the consultant. Because in some instances, the consultant went back after the application deadline and said to these people, your application is incomplete, we can't put it through, we need X, Y, and Z. So this is really pretty easy. I mean, unfortunately, we're having to discuss this. All we got to do is go to the consultant and do what you're being paid to do, right? I mean, if you look at the YMCA application, they were deficient when they put it in. There's a large amount they were looking for. And then I think in the middle of January, I think it was January 16th, we have in the packet, there's correspondence between the consultant and the Y saying, we need your stuff. So I don't see why that should, we just go to the consultant and say, do that, right? And then it goes back to the committee, and it gets back into that's the way to deal with this. My concern is those that have not, we've already scored many applications based upon the content, where there's been things missing. And I can't think of, other than tax returns and that kind of stuff, well, backup. Backup for a represented purchase. It's helpful for the committee that we see that stuff, right? You've done some research, those are the numbers, this makes sense. That's an incomplete application based upon our criteria, because you're supposed to have backup. That's something else that the consultant, I think, may have diminished some of the applications because it doesn't have that backup. But with regard to the ones that we have right now, I think we just go to the consultant, reach out, get the stuff, put it back in the loop, and let's just move forward. No motion necessary.
Counselor,
we have a contract.
Counselor Allenson.
So this just kind of brings me back to, if we want the documentation, either somebody can ask for it. I'm happy to do it as a member of the council. I'm also happy to communicate with the consultant, or I'm also happy to have the consultant do it, though, we know we're getting billed when we're doing that. So the other thing is, you can't change a tax return, so we're not asking somebody to add context or anything like that by providing additional documentation. This is something that was missed by the consultant that we hired, and if the consultant didn't realize that they didn't make the stipulation, we can't put the onus on the business. So let's just rectify it and move on. I mean, and I'm totally willing to rescind the application for whom I know it is from night one that had no tax return as well, and say pending a tax return, supporting these documents. We're not trying to recreate the wheel. We're not trying to negate any work that's being done. We're just trying to have a discussion on how to proceed. So I make a motion that we ask the parties which are missing documentation for the documentation to be considered by the committee.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Counselor Laffin. Discussion on the motion. Counselor Fishbein.
Who's we? Is it us, this body? Are we having Janice call the contractor that we have a contract with? Is it an individual?
Right now, it's the Queen's we. I'm happy to let you decide if you want that to be me, if you want that to be Janice.
I think between the consultant and my office, we could take care of whatever it is you decide that they can do.
Yeah, I'm in support of Janice reaching out to the consultant. And
But the motion is about tax documents, right?
It's just about whatever the missing documentation which is required. So either if they provided a P&L and it wasn't certified by a CPA, get the certification. If they don't have, if we want a tax, if like they don't have it certified by a CPA, but they have a tax return
Right.
because everybody
Okay.
should.
Perfect.
Well, there's a motion on the floor. It's moved, seconded. Any further discussion? Counselor Tada.
Thank you. I'm just really, I'm torn as to how to vote, because I'm concerned that there were maybe other, we're giving a second shot to some of these businesses, and I understand it seems like it was, through no fault of anybody here. It seems like the consultant maybe, made a mistake with these, but I'm still concerned that one was approved and without that required documentation, and I'm still concerned that maybe some people are getting a second stab at things now that they hear all of this other information. that was not information they had when they originally applied. So I'm not sure how to vote, because I don't want to give anybody an unfair advantage. I'm still concerned about the one we approved, but I also want the consultant to fix their mistake too, so I'm kind of torn on this.
You know, I could tell that one applicant that the grant won't go forward unless it's given to us.
Probably fair to condition the contract that way. So that resolves that. Any further discussion? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Allenson?
Yes.
Carmody?
Yes.
Fishbein?
Yes.
Laffin?
Yes.
Tata?
No.
Testa? Zandri?
Yes.
Chairman Cervoni.
Yes, the motion passes. I think those were the only items on your memo that required our action. Ms. Collins, are you still with us? Was on the phone. All right. Well, that being all the business on the agenda, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, I declare this meeting adjourned.